Alright, guys, welcome back to part 2 of the Dream Quest for Unknown Kadath. Let's jump right into it where we left off. Down through this verdant land Carter walked at evening, and saw twilight float up from the river to the marvelous golden spires of Thron. And just at the hour of dusk he came to the southern gate, and was stopped by a red-robed sentry till he had told 3 dreams beyond belief, and proved himself a dreamer worthy to walk upon Thran's steep, mysterious streets, and linger in bazaars where the wares of the ornate galleons were sold. Then into that incredible city he walked, through a wall so thick that the gate was a tunnel, and thereafter amidst curved and undulant ways winding deep and narrow between the heavenward towers. Light shone through grated and balconied windows, and the sound of lutes and pipes stole timid from inner courts where marble fountains bubbled. Carter knew his way, and edged down through darker streets to the river, where at an old sea tavern he found the captains and seamen he had known in myriad other dreams. There he bought his passage to Seriphos on a great green galleon, and there he stopped for the night, after speaking gravely to the venerable cat of that inn, who blinked dozing before an enormous hearth and dreamed of old wars and forgotten gods. In the morning Carter boarded the galleon bound for Seriphos, and sat at the prow as the ropes were cast off and the long sail down to the Cyrenian Sea began. For many leagues the banks were much as they were above Thron, with now and then a curious temple rising on the farther hills towards the right, and a drowsy village on the shore, with steep red roofs and nets spread in the sun. Mindful of his search, Carter questioned all the mariners closely about those whom they had met in the taverns of Seriphos, asking the names and ways of the strange men with long narrow eyes, long lobed ears, thin noses, and pointed chins, who came in dark ships from the north, and traded onyx for the carved jade and spun gold, and the little red singing birds of Seriphos. Of these men the sailors knew not much, save that they talked but seldom, and spread a kind of awe about them. Their land, very far away, was called Inganok, and not many people cared to go thither, because it was a cold twilight land, and said to be close to unpleasant Lang, although high impassable mountains towered on the side where Lang was thought to lie, so that none might say whether this evil plateau, with its horrible stone villages and unmentionable monastery, were really there, or whether the rumor were only a fear that timid people felt in the night when those formidable barrier peaks loomed black against a rising moon. Certainly, men reached Lang from very different oceans. Of other boundaries of Inganok these sailors had no notion, nor had they heard of the cold waste and unknown Kadath, save from vague, unplaced report, and of the marvelous sunset city which Carter sought they knew nothing at all. So the traveler asked no more far things, but bided his time till he might talk with those strange men from cold and twilight Inganok, who are the seed of such gods as carved their features on Nagarnek. Late in the day the galleon reached those bends of the river which traverse the perfumed jungles of Cled. Here Carter wished he might disembark, for in those tropic tangles sleep wondrous palaces of ivory, lone and unbroken, where once dwelt fabulous monarchs of a land whose name is forgotten. Spells of the elder ones keep those places unharmed and undecayed, for it is written that there may be one day need of them again, and elephant caravans have glimpsed them from afar by moonlight, though none dares approach them closely because of the guardians to which their wholeness is due. But the ship swept on, and dusk hushed the hum of the day, and the first stars above blinked answers to the early fireflies on the banks as that jungle fell far behind, leaving only its fragrance as a memory that it had been. And all through the night that galleon floated on past mysteries unseen and unsuspected. Once a lookout reported fires on the hills to the east, but the sleepy captain said they had better not be looked at too much, since it was highly uncertain just who or what had lit them. In the morning the river had broadened out greatly, and Carter saw by the houses along the banks that they were close to the vast trading city of Llaneth on the Cyrenian Sea. Here the walls are of rugged granite, and the houses peaked fantastically with beamed and plastered gables. The men of Llaneth are more like those of the waking world than any others in Dreamland, so that the city is not sought except for barter, but is prized for the solid work of its artisans. The wharves of Llaneth are of oak, and there the galleon made fast while the captain traded in the taverns. Carter also went ashore and looked curiously upon the rutted streets where wooden ox carts lumbered, and feverish merchants cried their wares vacuously in the bazaars. The sea taverns were all close to the wharves on cobbled lanes, salt with the spray of high tides, and seemed exceedingly ancient with their low black-beamed ceilings and casements of greenish bull's eyes panes. Ancient sailors in those taverns talked much of distant ports, and told many stories of the curious men from twilight Inganoch, but had little to add to what the seamen of the galleon had told. Then, at last, after much unloading and loading, the ship set sail once more over the sunset sea, and the high walls and gables of Llaneth grew less as the last golden light of day lent them a wonder and beauty beyond any men had given them. 2 nights and 2 days the galleon sailed over the Cyrenian Sea, sighing no land and speaking but one other vessel. Then near sunset of the second day there loomed up ahead the snowy peaks of Aran, with its ginkgo trees swaying on the lower slopes, and Carter knew that they were come to the land of Uth-Nargai and the marvelous city of Seliphos. Swiftly there came into sight the glittering minarets of that fabulous town, and the untarnished marble walls with their bronze statues, and the great stone bridge where Naraxa joins the sea. Then rose the green gentle hills behind the town, with their groves and gardens of asphodels, and the small shrines and cottages upon them, and far in the background the purple ridge of the Tanarians, potent and mystical, behind which lay forbidden ways into the waking world and towards other regions of dream. The harbor was full of painted galleys, some of which were from the marble cloud city of Saranian, that lies in ethereal space beyond where the sea meets the sky, and some of which were from more substantial ports on the oceans of Dreamland. Among these Stearman threaded his way up to the spice-fragrant wharves, where the galleon made fast in the dusk as the city's million lights began to twinkle out over the water. Ever new seemed this deathless city of vision, for here time has no power to tarnish or destroy. As it has always been, is still the turquoise temple of Nath-Horthath, and the 80 orchid-wreathed priests are the same who builded it 10,000 years ago. Shining still is the bronze of the great gates, nor are the onyx pavements ever worn or broken, and the great bronze statues on the walls look down on merchants and camel drivers older than fable, yet without one gray hair on their forked beards. Carter did not at once seek out the temple, or the palace, or the citadel, but stayed by the seaward among the traders and sailors, and when it was too late for rumors and legends, he sought out an ancient tavern he knew well, and rested with dreams of the gods on unknown Kadath whom he sought. The next day he searched all along the quays for some of the strange mariners of Inganoch, but was told that none were now in port, their galley not being due from the north for 2 full weeks. He found, however, one Thrabian sailor who had been to Inganoch and had worked in the onyx quarries of that twilight place, and this sailor said there was certainly a desert to the north of the peopled region, which everybody seemed to fear and shun. The Thorabanian opined that this desert led around the utmost rim of impassable peaks into Lang's horrible plateau, and that this was why men feared it, though he admitted there were other vague tales of evil presences and nameless sentinels. Whether or not this could be the fabled waste where an unknown Kadath stands, he did not know, but it seemed unlikely that those presences and sentinels, if indeed they truly existed, were stationed for naught. On the following day Carter walked up the Street of the Pillars to the turquoise temple and talked with the high priest. Though Nan-Horthath is chiefly worshipped in Seliphos, all the great ones are mentioned in diurnal prayers, and the priest was reasonably versed in their moods. Like Atal in distant Uthar, he strongly advised against any attempt to see them, declaring that they are testy and capricious, and subject to strange protection from the mindless other things from outside, whose soul and messenger is the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. Their jealous hiding of the marvelous Sunset City showed clearly that they did not wish Carter to reach it, and it was doubtful how they would regard a guest whose object was to see them and plead before them. No man had ever found Kadath in the past, and it might be just as well if none ever found it in the future. Such rumors as were told about that onyx castle of the Great Ones were not by any means reassuring. Having thanked the orchid-crowned high priest, Carter left the temple and sought the bazaar of the sheep butchers, where the old chief of Seliphos's cats dwelt sleek and contented. That gray and dignified being was sunning himself on the onyx pavement, and extended a languid paw as his caller approached. But when Carter repeated the passwords and introductions furnished him by the old cat general of Uthar, the furry patriarch became very cordial and communicative, and told much of the secret lore known to cats on the seaward slopes of Uth-Nargai. Best of all, he repeated several things told him furtively by the timid waterfront cats of Seliphos about the men of Inganok, on whose dark ships no cat will go. It seems that these men have an aura not of earth about them, though that is not the reason why no cat will sail on their ships. The reason for this is that Inganok holds shadows which no cat can endure, so that in all that cold twilight realm there is a never-changing purr on a homely mew, whether it be because of things wafted over the impassable peaks from hypothetical Lang, or because of things filtered down from the chilly desert to the north, none may say. But it remains a fact that in far land there broods a hint of outer space which cats do not like, and to which they are more sensitive than men. Therefore they will not go on the dark ships that seek the basalt quays of Inganok. The old chief of the cats also told him where to find his friend King Karanes, who in Carter's later dreams had reigned alternately in the rose crystal palace of the 70 Delights at Seliphos and in the turreted cloud castle of sky-floating Seranian. It seems that he could no more find content in those places, but had formed a mighty longing for the English cliffs and downlands of his boyhood, where, in little dreaming villages, England's old songs hover at evening behind lattice windows, and where gray church towers peep lovely through the verdant of distant valleys. He could not go back to these things in the waking world because his body was dead, but he had done the next best thing and dreamed a small tract of such countryside in the region east of the city, where meadows roll gracefully up the sea cliffs to the foot of the Tanarian hills. There he dwelt in a gray Gothic manor house of stone looking on the sea, and tried to think it was ancient Trevor Towers, where he was born and where 13 generations of his forefathers had first seen the light. And on the coast nearby he had built a little Cornish fishing village with steep cobbled ways, setting therein such people as had the most English faces, and seeking ever to teach them dear remembered accents of old Cornwall fishers. And in a valley not far off he had reared a great Norman abbey whose tower he could see from his window, placing around it the churchyard grey stones with the names of his ancestors carved thereon, and with a moss somewhat like old England's moss. For though Karanes was a monarch in the land of dream, with all imagined pomps and marvels, splendors and beauties, ecstasies and delights, novelties and excitements at his command, he would gladly have resigned forever the whole of his power and luxury and freedom for one blessed day as a simple boy in that pure and quiet England, that ancient, beloved England which had molded his being, and of which he must always be immutably a part. So, when Carter bade that old grey chief of the cats adieu, he did not seek the terraced palace of rose crystal, but walked out the eastern gate and across the daisied fields towards a peak-gabled great hedge, and a gate with a little brick lodge, and when he rang the bell there, hobbled to admit him, no robed or anointed lackey of the palace, but a small stubby old man in a smock, who spoke as best he could in the quaint tones of far Cornwall. And Carter walked up the shady path between trees as near as possible to England's trees, and climbed the terraces amongst gardens set out in Queen Anne's time. At the door, flanked by stone cats in the old way, he was met by a whiskered butler in suitable livery, and was presently taken to the library, where Karanes, lord of Uth-Nargai, and the sky around Seranian, sat pensive in a chair by the window, looking on his little sea-coast village, and wishing that his old nurse would come in and scold him, because he was not ready for that hateful lawn party at the vicar's, with the carriage waiting and his mother nearly out of patience. Caranes, clad in a dressing gown of the sort favored by London tailors in his youth, rose eagerly to meet his guest, for the sight of an Anglo-Saxon from the waking world was very dear to him, even if it was a Saxon from Boston, Massachusetts, instead of from Cornwall. And for long they talked of old times, having much to say because both were old dreamers and well versed in the wonders of incredible places. Caranes, indeed, had been out beyond the stars in the ultimate void, and was said to be the only one who had ever returned sane from such a voyage. At length Carter brought up the subject of his quest, and asked of his host those questions he had asked of so many others. Caranes did not know where Kadath was, or the marvelous Sunset City, but he did know that the Great Ones were very dangerous creatures to seek out, and that the other gods had strange ways of protecting them from impertinent curiosity. He had learned much of the other gods in distant parts of space, especially in that region where form does not exist, and colored gases study the innermost secrets. The violet gas Simak had told him terrible things of the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep, and had warned him never to approach the central void where the demon Sultan Azathoth gnaws hungrily in the dark. Altogether, it was not well to meddle with the Elder Ones, and if they persistently denied all access to the marvelous Sunset City, it were better not to seek that city. Caranes furthermore doubted whether his guest would profit aught by coming to the city even were he to gain it. He himself had dreamed and yearned long years for lovely Siliphos and the lands of Uth-Nergai, and for the freedom and color and high experience of life devoid of its chains, conventions, and stupidities. But now that he was come into that city and that land, and was the king thereof, he found that the freedom and vividness all too soon worn out, and monotonous for want of linkage with anything firm in his feelings and memories. He was a king in Uth-Nergai, but found no meaning therein, and drooped always for the old familiar things of England that had shaped his youth. All his kingdom he would give for the sound of Cornish church bells over the downs, and all the 1,000 minarets of Seliphos for the steep homely roofs of the village near his home. So he told his guest that the unknown Sunset City might not hold quite the content he sought, and that perhaps it had better remain a glorious and half-remembered dream, for he had visited Carter often in the old waking days, and knew well the lovely New England slopes that had given him birth. At the last, he was very certain, the seeker would long only for the early remembered scenes, the glow of Beacon Hill at evening, the tall steeples and winding hill streets of quaint Kingsport, the hoary gambrel roofs of ancient and witch-haunted Arkham, and the blessed miles of meads and valleys where stone walls rambled and white farmhouse gables peeped out from bowers of verdure. These things he told to Randolph Carter, but still the seeker held to his purpose, and in the end they parted each with his own conviction, and Carter went back through the bronze gate into Seliphos, and down the street of pillars to the old sea-wall, where he talked more with the mariners of far parts, and waited for the dark ship from cold and twilight Inganok, whose strange-faced sailors and onyx traders had in them the blood of the great ones. One starlight evening, when the Pharos shone splendid over the harbor, the longed-for ship put in, and the strange-faced sailors and traders appeared one by one, and group by group in the ancient taverns along the sea-wall. It was very exciting to see again those living faces, so like the godlike features on Nagranic, but Carter did not hasten to speak with these silent seamen. He did not know how much of pride and secrecy and dim supernal memory might fill those children of the Great Ones, and was sure it would not be wise to tell him of his quest, or ask too closely of that cold desert stretching north of their twilight land. They talked little with the other folk in those ancient sea taverns, but would gather in groups in remote corners and sing among themselves the haunting airs of unknown places, or chant long tales to one another in accents alien to the rest of dreamland. And so rare and moving were those airs and tales that one might guess their wonders from the faces of those who listened, even though the words came to common ears only as strange cadence and obscure melody. For a week the strange seamen lingered in the taverns and traded in the bazaars of Siliphos, and before they sailed Carter had taken passage on their dark ship, telling them that he was an old onyx miner and wishful to work in their quarries. That ship was very lovely and cunningly wrought, being of teak wood with ebony fittings and traceries of gold, and the cabin in which the traveler lodged had hangings of silk and velvet. One morning, at the turn of the tide, the sails were raised and the anchor lifted, and as Carter stood in the high stern he saw the sunrise blazing walls, and bronze statues and golden minarets of ageless Seliphos sink into the distance, and the snowy peak of Mount Aran grow smaller and smaller. By noon there was nothing in sight save the gentle blue of the Cyrenian Sea, with one painted galley afar off bound for that cloud-hung realm of Cyrenian where the sea meets the sky. And night came with gorgeous stars, and the dark ship steered for Charles Wain and the Little Bear as they swung slowly round the pole. And the sailors sang strange songs of unknown places, and they stole off one by one to the forecastle, while the wistful watchers murmured old chants and leaned over the rail to glimpse the luminous fish playing in bowers beneath the sea. Carter went to sleep at midnight and rose in the glow of a young morning, marking that the sun seemed farther south than it was its wont, and all through the second day he made progress in knowing the men of the ship, getting them little by little to talk of their cold twilight land, of their exquisite onyx city, and of the fear of the high and impassable peaks beyond which Lang was said to be. They told him how sorry they were that no cats would stay in the land of Inganok, and how they thought the hidden nearness of Lang was to blame for it. Only the stony desert to the north they would not talk. There was something disquieting about that desert, and it was thought expedient not to admit its existence. On later days they talked of the quarries in which Carter said he was going to work. There were many of them, for all the city of Inganok was built of onyx, while great polished blocks of it were traded in Renar, Ogothron, and Seliphos, and at home with the merchants of Thra, Elarnec, and Kadatheron, for the beautiful wares of those fabulous ports. And far to the north, almost in that cold desert whose existence the men of Inganok did not care to admit, there was an unused quarry, greater than all the rest, from which had been hewn in forgotten times such prodigious lumps and blocks that the sight of their chiseled vacancies struck terror to all who beheld. Who had mined those incredible blocks, and whither they had been transported, no man might say, but it was thought best not to trouble that quarry, around which such inhuman memories might conceivably cling. So it was left all alone in that twilight, with only the raven and the rumored shantok bird to brood on its immensities. When Carter heard of this quarry he was moved to deep thought, for he knew from old tales that the Great One's castle atop unknown Kadath is of onyx. Each day the sun wheeled lower and lower in the sky, and the mists overhead grew thicker and thicker, and in 2 weeks there was not any sunlight at all, but only a weird gray twilight shining through a dome of eternal cloud by night, and a cold, starless phosphorescence from the underside of that cloud by night. On the 20th day a great jagged rock in the sea was sighted from afar, the first land glimpse since Aran's snowy peak had dwindled beyond that ship. Carter asked the captain the name of that rock, but was told that it had no name, and had never been sought by any vessel because of the sounds that came from it at night. And when, after dark, a dull and ceaseless howling arose from that jagged granite place, the traveler was glad that no stop had been made, and that the rock had no name. The seamen prayed and chanted till the noise was out of earshot, and Carter dreamed terrible dreams, within dreams, in the small hours. Two mornings after that, there loomed far ahead into the east a line of gray, great peaks, whose tops were lost in the changeless clouds of that twilight world. And at the sight of them the sailors sang glad songs, and some knelt down on the deck to pray, so that Carter knew they were come to the land of Inganok, and would soon be moored to the basalt quays of the great town bearing that land's name. Toward noon, a dark coastline appeared, and before 3 o'clock there stood out against the north the boldest domes and fantastic spires of the Onyx City. Rare and curious did that archaic city rise above its walls and quays, all of delicate black with scrolls, flutings, and arabesques of inlaid gold. Tall and many-windowed were the houses, and carved on every side with flowers and patterns whose dark symmetries dazzled the eye with a beauty more poignant than light. Some ended in swelling domes that tapered to a point, others in terraced pyramids wherein rose clustered minarets, displaying every phase of strangeness and imagination. The walls were low, and pierced by frequent gates, each under a great arch rising high above the general level and capped by the head of a god, chiseled with that same skill displayed in the monstrous face on distant Nagranec. On a hill in the center rose a 16-angled tower, greater than all the rest, and bearing a high pinnacled belfry resting on a flattened dome. This, the seaman said, was the temple of the Elder Ones, and was ruled by an old high priest sad with inner secrets. At intervals the clang of a strange bell shivered over the Onyx City, answered each time by a peal of mystic music made up of horns, viols, and chanting voices. And from a row the tripods on a galley round the high dome of that temple there burst flames of flares at certain moments, for the priests and people of that city were wise in the primal mysteries, and faithful in keeping the rhythms of the great ones, as set forth in scrolls older than the Panoptic manuscripts. As the ship rode past the great basalt breakwater into the harbor, the lesser noises of the city grew manifest, and Carter saw the slaves, sailors, and merchants on the docks. The sailors and merchants were of the strange-faced race of the gods, but the slaves were squat, slant-eyed folk, said by rumor to have drifted somehow across or around the impossible peaks from valleys beyond Lang. The wharves reached wide outside the city wall and bore upon them all manner of merchandise from the galleys anchored there, while at one end were great piles of onyx carved and uncarved awaiting shipment to the far markets of Renar, Orgothon, and Celephos. It was not yet evening when the dark ship anchored beside a jutting quay of stone, and all the sailors and traders filed ashore and through the arched gate into the city. The streets of that city were paved with onyx, and some of them were wide and straight, whilst others were crooked and narrow. The houses near the water were lower than the rest, and bore above their curiously arched doorways certain signs of gold, said to be in honor of the respective small gods that favored each. The captain of the ship took Carter to an old sea tavern, where flocked the mariners of quaint countries, and promised that he would next day show him wonders of the Twilight City, and lead him to the taverns of the onyx miners by the northern wall. And evening fell, and little bronze lamps were lighted, and the sailors in that tavern sang songs of remote places. But when from its high tower the great bell shivered over the city, and the peal of the horns and viols and voices rose cryptical in answer thereto, all ceased their songs or tales, and bowed silent till the last echoed away. For there is a wonder and a strangeness on the twilight city of Inganoch, and men fear to be lax in its rites, lest a doom and a vengeance lurk unsuspectingly close. Far in the shadows of that tavern, Carter saw a squat form he did not like, for it was unmistakably that of the old slant-eyed merchant he had seen so long before in the taverns of Dyloth Lean, who was reputed to trade with the horrible stone villagers of Lang, which no healthy folk visit, and whose evil fires are seen at night from afar, and even to have dealt with that high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face, and dwells all alone in a prehistoric stone monastery. This man had seemed to show a queer gleam of knowing when Carter asked the traders of Dyloth Lean about the cold waste in Kadath, and somehow his presence in dark and haunted Inganoch, so close to the wonders of the north, was not a reassuring thing. He slipped wholly out of sight before Carter could speak to him, and sailors later said that he had come with a yak caravan from some point not well determined, bearing the colossal and rich-flavored eggs of the rumored shantak bird to trade for the dexterous jade goblets that merchants brought from Larnac. On the following morning, the ship captain led Carter through the onyx streets of Inganoch, dark under their twilight sky. The inlaid doors and figured house fronts, carven balconies, and crystal-paneled oriels all gleamed with a somber and polished loveliness, and now and then a plaza would open out with black pillars, colonnades, and the statues of curious beings both human and fabulous. Some of the vistas down long and unbending streets, or through side alleys and over bulbous domes, spires, and arabesqued roofs, were weird and beautiful beyond words, and nothing was more splendid than the massive height of the great simple temple of the old ones, and its 16 carven sides, its flattened dome, and its lofty pinnacled belfry overtopping all else, and majestic whatever its foreground. And always to the east, far beyond the city's walls and the leagues of pasture land, rose the gaunt gray sides of those topless and impassable peaks across which hideous Lang was said to lie. The captain took Carter to the mighty temple, which is set with its walled garden and a great round plaza, whence the streets go as spokes from a mighty wheel. The 7 arched gates of that garden, each having over it a carven face like those on the city's gates, are always open, and the people roam reverently at will down the tiled path and through little lanes lined with grotesque termini and the shrines of modest gods. And there are fountains, pools, and basins there to reflect the frequent blaze of the tripods on the high balcony, all of onyx and having in them small luminous fish taken by divers from the lower bowers of ocean. When the deep clang from the temple's belfry shivers over the garden and the city, and the answer of the horns and viols and voices peals out from the 7 lodges by the garden gates, there issue from the 7 doors of the temple long columns of masked and hooded priests in black, bearing at arm's length before them great golden bowls from which a curious steam arises, and all the 7 columns strut peculiarly in single file, legs thrown far forward without bending the knees, down the walks that lead to the 7 lodges, wherein they disappear and do not appear again. It is said that the subterranean paths connect the lodges with the temple, and that the long files of priests return through them, nor is it unwhispered that deep flights of onyx steps go down to mysteries that are never told, but only a few are those who hint that the priests in the masked and hooded columns are not human priests. Carter did not enter the temple, because none but the veiled king is permitted to do that. But before he left the garden, the hour of the bell came, and he heard the shivering clang deafeningly above him, and the wailing of the horns and the viols and the voices loud from the lodges by the gates. And down the 7 great walks stalked the long files of bowl-bearing priests in their singular way, giving to the traveler a fear which human priests do not often give. When the last of them had vanished, he left that garden, noting as he did so a spot on the pavement over which the bulls had passed. Even the ship captain did not like that spot, and hurried him on towards the hill where the veiled king's palace rises many-domed and marvelous. The ways to the onyx palace are steep and narrow, all but that broad curving one where the king and his companions ride on yaks or in yak-drawn chariots. Carter and his guide climbed up an alley that was all steps, between inlaid walls bearing strange signs in gold, and under balconies and oriels whence sometimes floated soft strains of music or breaths of exotic fragrance. Always ahead loomed those Titan walls, mighty buttresses, and clustered and bulbous domes for which the veiled king's palace is famous. And at length they passed under a great black arch and emerged in the gardens of the monarch's pleasure. There Carter paused in faintness at so much beauty, for the onyx terraces and colonnaded walks, the gay parterres and delicate flowering trees, espaliered to golden lattices, that brazen urns and tripods with cunning bas-reliefs, the pedestaled and almost breathing statues of veined black marble, the basalt-bottomed lagoons and tiled fountains with luminous fish, the tiny temples of iridescent singing birds atop carven columns, and the marvelous scrollwork of the great bronze gates. And the blossoming vines trailed along every inch of the polished walls, all joined to form a sight whose loveliness was quite beyond reality, and half fabulous even in the land of dream. There it shimmered like a vision under that gray twilight sky, with the domed and fretted magnificence of the palace ahead, and the fantastic silhouette of the distant impassable peaks on the right. And ever the small birds in the fountains sang, while the perfume of rare blossoms spread like a veil over that incredible garden. No other human presence was there, and Carter was quite glad it was so. Then they turned and descended again the onyx alley of steps, for the palace itself no visitor may enter, and it is not well to look too long and steadily at the great central dome, since it is said to house the archaic father of all the rumored shantak birds, and to send out queer dreams to the curious. After that, the captain took Carter to the north quarter of the town, near the gate of the caravans, where the taverns of the yak merchants and the onyx miners. And there, in a low-ceilinged inn of quarrymen, they said farewell. For business called the captain, while Carter was eager to talk with the miners about the north. There were many men in that inn, and the traveler was not long in speaking to some of them, saying that he himself was an old miner of onyx, and anxious to know somewhat of Ingenok's quarries. But all that he learnt was not much more than he knew before, for the miners were timid and evasive about the cold desert to the north, and the quarry that no man visits. They had fears of fabled emissaries from around the mountains where Lang is said to lie, and of evil presences and nameless sentinels far north among the scattered rocks. And they whispered also that the rumored shantak birds are no wholesome things, it being indeed for the best that no man has ever truly seen one, for that fabled father of the shantaks in the king's dome is fed in the dark. The next day, saying that he wished to look over all the various mines for himself, and to visit the scattered farms and quaint onyx villages of Ingenok, Carter hired a yak and stuffed great leathern saddlebags for a journey. Beyond the gate of the caravans the road lay straight betwixt tiled fields, with many odd farmhouses crowned by low domes. At some of these houses the seeker stopped to ask questions, once finding a host so austere and reticent, and so full of unpalaced majesty, like to that in the huge features on Nagranek, that he felt certain that he had come at last upon one of the great ones themselves, or upon one with full 10/9 of their blood, 9/10, dwelling amongst men, and to that austere and reticent Carter he was careful to speak very well of the gods, and to praise all the blessings they had ever accorded him. That night, Carter camped in a roadside meadow beneath a great ligath tree, to which he tied his yak, and in the morning he resumed his northward pilgrimage. At about 10 o'clock he reached the small domed village of Urg, where traders rest and miners tell their tales, and paused in its taverns till noon. It is here that the great cavern road turns west towards Salarn, but Carter kept on north by the quarry road. All the afternoon he followed that rising road, which was somehow narrower than the great highway, and which now led through a region with more rocks than tilled fields. And by evening the low hills on his left had risen into sizable black cliffs, so that he knew he was close to the mining country. All the while, the great gaunt sides of the impassable mountains towered afar off to his right, and the farther he went, the worse tales he heard of them from the scattered farmers and traders and drivers of the lumbering onyx carts along the way. On the second night he camped in the shadow of a large black crag, tethering his yak to a stake driven in the ground. He observed the greater phosphorescence of the clouds at this northerly point, and more than once he thought he saw dark shapes outlined against them, and on the third morning he came in sight of the first onyx quarry, and greeted the men who there labored with picks and chisels. Before evening he had passed 11 quarries, the land being here given over altogether to onyx cliffs and boulders, with no vegetation at all, but only great rocky fragments scattered about a floor of black earth, with the gray impassable peaks always rising, gaunt and sinister, on his right. The third night he spent at a camp of quarrymen whose flickering fires cast weird reflections on the polished cliffs to the west, and they sang many songs and told many tales, showing such strange knowledge of the olden days and the habits of gods that Carter could see they held many latent memories of their sires, the great ones. They asked him whither he went, and cautioned him not to go too far to the north, but he replied that he was seeking new cliffs of onyx, and would take no more risks than were common among prospectors. In the morning he bade them adieu, and rode on into the darkening north, where they had warned him he would find the feared and unvisited quarry, whence hands older than men's hands had wrenched prodigious blocks. But he did not like it when turning back to wave a last farewell. He thought he saw approaching the camp that squat and evasive old merchant with slanting eyes, whose conjectured traffic with Lang was the gossip of distant Dilath-Leen. After 2 more quarries, the inhabited part of Inganoch seemed to end, and the road narrowed to a steeply rising yak path among forbidding black cliffs. Always on the right towered the gaunt and distant peaks, and as Carter climbed farther and farther into this untraversed realm, he found it grew darker and colder. Soon he perceived that there were no prints of feet or hooves on the black path beneath, and realized that he was indeed come into strange and deserted ways of elder time. Once in a while a raven would croak far ahead, and now and then a flapping behind some vast rock would make him think uncomfortably of the rumored shantak bird. But in the main he was alone with his shaggy steed, and it troubled him to observe that this excellent yak became more and more reluctant to advance, and more disposed to snort affrightedly at any small noise along the route. The path now contracted between sable and glistening walls, and began to display an even greater steepness than before. It was a bad footing, and the yak often slipped on the stony fragments strewn thickly about it. In 2 hours Carter saw ahead a definite crest, beyond which was nothing but a dull gray sky, and blessed the prospect of a level or downward course. To reach this crest, however, was no easy task, for the way had grown nearly perpendicular, and it was perilous with loose black gravel and small stones. Eventually Carter dismounted and led his dubious yak, pulling very hard when the animal balked or stumbled, and keeping his own footing as best he might. Then suddenly he came to the top and saw beyond, and gasped at what he saw. The path indeed led straight ahead and slightly down, with the same lines of high natural walls as before, but on the left hand there opened out a monstrous space, vast acres in extent, where some archaic power had riven and rent the native cliffs of onyx, in the form of a giant's quarry. Far back into the solid precipice ran that cyclopean gouge, and deep down within earth's bowels its lower delvings yawned. It was no quarry of man, and the concave sides were scarred with great squares, yards wide, which told of the size of the blocks once hewn by nameless hands and chisels. High over its jagged rim huge ravens flapped and croaked, and vague whirrings in the unseen depths told of bats or urhags, or less mentioned presences haunting the endless blackness. There Carter stood in the narrow way amidst the twilight, with a rocky path sloping down before him, tall onyx cliffs on his right that led on as far as he could see, and tall cliffs on the left chopped off just ahead to make that terrible and unearthly quarry. All at once the yak uttered a cry and burst from his control, leaping past him and darting on in a panic, till it vanished down the narrow slope towards the north. Stone kicked by its flying hooves, fell over the brink of the quarry, and lost themselves in the dark without any sound of striking bottom. But Carter ignored the perils of that scanty path as he raced breathlessly after the flying steed. Soon the left-hand cliff resumed their course, making the way once more a narrow lane, and still the traveler leaped on after the yak whose great wide prints told of its desperate flight. Once he thought he heard the hoof-beats of the frightened beast, and doubled his speed from this encouragement. He was covering miles, and little by little the way was broadening in front, till he knew he must soon emerge on the cold and dreaded desert to the north. The gaunt gray flanks of the distant impassable peaks were again visible above the right-hand crags, and ahead were the rocks and boulders of an open space which was clearly a foretaste of the dark and limitless plain. And once more those hoof-beats sounded in his ears, plainer than before, but this time giving terror instead of encouragement, because he realized that they were not the frightful hoof-beats of his fleeing yak. These beats were ruthless and purposeful, and they were behind him. Carter's pursuit of the yak now became a flight from an unseen thing, for though he dared not glance over his shoulder, he felt that the presence behind him could be nothing wholesome or mentionable. His yak must have heard or felt it first, and he did not like to ask himself whether it had followed him from the haunts of men, or had floundered up out of that black quarry pit. Meanwhile the cliffs had been left behind, so that the oncoming night fell over a great waste of sand and spectral rocks, wherein all paths were lost. He could not see the hoof-prints of the yak, but always from behind him there came that detestable clopping, mingled now and then with what he fancied were titanic flappings and whirrings. That he was losing ground seemed unhappily clear to him, and he knew he was hopelessly lost in this broken and blasted desert of meaningless rocks and untraveled sands. Only those remote and impassable peaks on the right gave him any sense of direction, and even they were less clear as the gray twilight waned and the sticky phosphorescence of the clouds took its place. Then, dim and misty in the darkling north before him, he glimpsed a terrible thing. He had thought of it mere moments, a range of black mountains, but now he saw it was something more. The phosphorescence of the brooding clouds showed it plainly, and even silhouetted parts of it as low vapors glowed behind. How distant it was he could not tell, but it must have been very far. It was thousands of feet high, stretching in a great concave arc from the gray impassable peaks to the unimagined westward spaces, and had once indeed been a ridge of mighty onyx hills. But now those hills were hills no more, for some hand greater than man's had touched them. Silent, they squatted there atop the world like wolves or ghouls, crowned with clouds and mists and guarding the secrets of the north forever. All in a great half-circle they squatted, those dog-like mountains carved into monstrous watching statues, and their right hands were raised in menace against mankind. It was only the flickering light of the clouds that made their mitred devil heads seem to move. But as Carter stumbled on, he saw arise from their shadowy laps great forms whose motions were no delusion. Winged and whirring, those forms grew larger each moment, and the traveler knew his stumbling was at an end. They were not any birds or bats known elsewhere on earth or in dreamland, for they were larger than elephants and had heads like horses. Carter knew that they must be the shantak birds of ill rumor, and wondered no more what evil guardians and nameless sentinels made men avoid the boreal rock desert, and as he stopped in final resignation, he dared at last to look behind him, where indeed was trotting the squat, slant-eyed trader of evil legend, grinning astride a lean yak and leading on a noxious horde of leering shantaks to whose wings still clung the rime and nitre of the nether pits. So unfortunately, Carter is 3 for 3 in terms of getting his mounts killed at this point. Sad to hear it. Trapped though he was by fabulous and hipposyllaphic winged nightmares that pressed around in great unholy circles, Randolph Carter did not lose consciousness. Lofty and horrible, those Titan gargoyles towered above him, while the slant-eyed merchant leaped down from his yak and stood grinning before the captive. Then the man motioned Carter to mount one of the repugnant shantaks, helping him up as his judgment struggled with his loathing. It was hard work ascending, for the shantak bird has scales instead of feathers, and those scales are very slippery. Once he was seated, the slant-eyed man hopped up behind him, leaving the lean yak to be led away northward toward the ring of carven mountains by one of the incredible bird colossi. There now followed a hideous whirl through frigid space, endlessly up and eastward toward the gaunt gray flanks of those impassable mountains, beyond which Lang was said to lie. Far above the clouds they flew, till at last there lay beneath them those fabled summits which the folk of Inganok had never seen, and which lie always in high vortices of gleaming mist. Carter beheld them very plainly as they passed below, and saw upon their topmost peaks strange caves which made him think of those on Nagranek. But he did not question his captor about these things when he noticed that both the man and the horse-headed shantak appeared oddly fearful of them, hurrying past nervously and showing great tension until they were far left in the rear. The shantak now flew lower, revealing beneath the canopy of a cloud a gray barren plain wherein at great distances shone little feeble fires. As they descended there appeared at intervals lone huts of granite and bleak stone villages whose tiny windows glowed with pallid light. And there came from those huts and villages a shrill droning of pipes and a nauseous rattle of crotala, which proved at once that Inganok's people are right in their geographic rumors, for travelers have heard such sounds before, and know that they float only from the cold desert plateau, which healthy folk never visit, that hateful place of evil and mystery which is Lang. Around the feeble fires dark forms were dancing, and Carter was curious as to what manner of beings they might be, for no healthy folk have ever been to Lang, and the place is known only by its fires and stone huts as seen from afar. Very slowly and awkwardly did those forms leap, and with an insane twisting and bending not good to behold, so that Carter did not wonder at the monstrous evil imputed to them by vague legend, or the fear in which all dreamland holds their abhorrent frozen plateau. As the shantak flew lower, the repulsiveness of the dancers became tinged with a certain hellish familiarity, and the prisoner kept straining his eyes and racking his memory for clues to where he had seen such creatures before. They leaped as though they had hooves instead of feet, and seemed to wear a sort of wig or headpiece with small horns. Of other clothing they had none, but most of them were quite furry. Behind they had dwarfish tails, and when they glanced upward he saw the excessive width of their mouths. Then he knew what they were, and that they did not wear any wigs or headpieces after all, for the cryptic folk of Lang were of one race with the uncomfortable merchants of the black galleys that traded rubies at Dilathleen, those not quite human merchants who are the slaves of the monstrous moon things. They were indeed the same dark folk who had shanghaied Carter on their noisome galley so long ago, and whose kith he had seen driven in herds about the unclean wharves of that accursed lunar city, with the leaner ones toiling and the fatter ones taken away in crates for other needs of their polypous and amorphous masters. Now he saw where such ambiguous creatures came from, and shuddered at the thought that Lang must be known to these formless abominations from the moon. But the shantak flew on past the fires and the stone huts and the less than human dancers, and soared over sterile hills of gray granite and dim wastes of rock and ice and snow. Day came, and the phosphorescence of low clouds gave place to the misty twilight of that northern world, and still the vile bird winged meaningfully through the cold and silence. At times the slant-eyed man talked with his steed in a hateful and guttural language, and the shantak would answer with tittering tones that rasped like the scratching of ground glass. All this while the land was getting higher, and finally they came to a windswept tableland which seemed the very roof of a blasted and tenantless world. There, all alone, in the hush and the dusk and the cold, rose the uncouth stones of a squat, windowless building, around which a circle of crude monoliths stood. In all this arrangement there was nothing, and Carter surmised from old tales that he was indeed come to that most dreadful and legendary of all places, the remote and prehistoric monastery wherein dwells, uncompanioned, the high priest not to be described, which wears a yellow silken mask over its face, and prays to the other gods and their crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. The loathsome bird now settled to the ground, and the slant-eyed man hopped down and helped his captive alight. Of the purpose of his seizure, Carter now felt very sure, for clearly the slant-eyed merchant was an agent of the darker powers, eager to drag before his masters a mortal whose presumption had aimed at the finding of unknown Kadath, and the saying of a prayer before the faces of the great ones in their onyx castle. It seemed likely that this merchant had caused his former capture by the slaves of the moon things in Dilathleen, and that he now meant to do what the rescuing cats had baffled, taking the victim to some dread rendezvous with monstrous Nyarlathotep, and telling with what boldness the seeking of unknown Kadath had been tried. Lang and the cold waste of North Inganak must be close to the other gods, and there the passes Kadath are well guarded. The slant-eyed man was small, but the great hippocephalic bird was there to see he was obeyed, so Carter followed where he led, and passed within the circle of standing rocks, and into the low arched doorway of that windowless stone monastery. There were no lights inside, but the evil merchant lit a small clay lamp bearing morbid bas-reliefs, and prodded his prisoner on through mazes of narrow-winded corridors. On the walls of the corridors were painted frightful scenes older than history, and in a style unknown to the archaeologists of Earth. After countless eons their pigments were brilliant still, for the cold and dryness of hideous Lang kept alive many primal things. Carter saw them fleetingly in the rays of that dim and moving lamp, and shuddered at the tale they told. Through these archaic frescoes Lang's annals stalked, and the horned, hooved, and wide-mouthed almost human danced evilly amongst forgotten cities. There were scenes of old wars, wherein Lang's almost human fought with the bloated purple spiders of the neighboring vales, and there were scenes also of the coming of the black galleys from the moon, and the submission of Lang's people to the polypus and amorphous blasphemies that hopped and floundered and wriggled out of them. Those slippery, grayish-white blasphemies they worshipped as gods, nor ever complained when scores of their best and fatted males were taken away in the black galleys. The monstrous moon beasts made their camp on a jagged isle of the sea, and Carter could tell from the frescoes that this was none other than the lone nameless rock he had seen when sailing to Inganok, that gray accursed rock which Inganok's seamen shun, and from which vile howlings reverberate all throughout the night. And in those frescoes was shown the great seaport and capital of the almost humans, proud and pillared betwixt the cliffs and the basalt wharves, and wondrous with high fanes and carven places. Great gardens and columned streets led from the cliffs, and from each of the 6 sphinx-crowned gates to a vast central plaza. And in that plaza was a pair of winged colossal lions, guarding the top of a subterranean staircase. Again and again were those huge winged lions shown, their mighty flanks of diorite glistening in the gray twilight of the day, and the cloudy phosphorescence of the night. And as Carter stumbled past their frequent and repeated pictures, it came to him at last what indeed they were, and what city it was that the almost humans had ruled so anciently before the coming of the black galleys. There could be no mistake, for the legends of Dreamland are generous and profuse. Indubitably that primal city was no less a place than storied Sarmokand, whose ruins had bleached for 1,000,000 years before the first humans saw the light, and whose twin titan lions guard eternally the steps that led down from dreamland to the great abyss. Other views showed the gaunt gray peaks dividing Lang from Inganok, and the monstrous shantak birds that built nests on the ledges halfway up. And they showed likewise the curious caves near the very topmost pinnacles, and how even the boldest of the shantaks fly screaming away from them. Carter had seen those caves when he passed over them, and had noticed their likeness to the caves on Nagranek. Now he knew that the likeness was more than a chance one, for in those pictures were shown their fearsome denizens, those bat wings, curved horns, barbed tails, prehensile paws, and rubbery bodies were not strange to him. He had met those silent, flitting, and clutching creatures before, those mindless guardians of the great abyss, whom even the great ones fear, and who own not Nyarlathotep, but hoary Nodens as their lord, for they were the dreaded night gaunts, who never laugh or smile because they have no faces, and who flop unendingly in the dark betwixt the Vale of Panath and the passes to the outer world. The slant-eyed merchant had now prodded Carter into a great domed space whose walls were carved in shocking bas-reliefs, and whose center held a gaping circular pit surrounded by 6 malignly stained stone altars in a ring. There was no light in this vast and evil-smelling crypt, and the small lamp of the sinister merchant shone so feebly that one could grasp details only little by little. At the farther end was a high stone dais reached by 5 steps, and there on a golden throne sat a lumpish figure, robed in yellow silk, figured with red, and having a yellow silken mask over its face. To this being, the slant-eyed man made certain signs with his hands, and the lurker in the dark replied by raising a disgustingly carven flute of ivory in silk-covered paws, and blowing certain loathsome sounds from beneath its flowing yellow mask. This colloquy went on for some time, and to Carter there was something sickening familiar in the sound of that flute, and the stench of the malodorous place. It made him think of a frightful red-litten city, and of the revolting procession that once filled through it. Of that, and of an awful climb through the lunar countryside beyond, before the rescuing rush of Earth's friendly cats. He knew that the creature on the dais was without doubt the high priest not to be described, of which legend whispers such fiendish and abnormal possibilities, but he feared to think just what that abhorred high priest might be. Then the figured silk slipped a trifle from one of the grayish-white paws, and Carter knew what the noisome high priest was. And in that hideous second, stark fear drove him to something his reason would never have dared to attempt. For in all his shaken consciousness, there was room only for one frantic will to escape from what squatted on that golden throne. He knew that hopeless labyrinths of stone lay betwixt him and the cold tableland outside, and that even on that tableland the noxious shantak still awaited. Yet, in spite of all this, there was in his mind only the instant need to get away from that wriggling, silk-robed monstrosity. The slant-eyed man had set his curious lamp upon one of the high and wickedly stained altar stones by the pit, and had moved forward somewhat to talk the high priest with his hands. Carter, hitherto wholly passive, now gave that man a terrific push with all the wild strength of fear, so that the victim toppled at once into that gaping well which rumor holds to reach down to the hellish vaults of Zen, where gugs hunt ghasts in the dark. In almost the same second he seized the lamp from the altar and darted out into the frescoed labyrinth, racing this way and that as chance determined, and trying not to think of the stealthily padding of shapeless paws on stones behind him, or of the silent wriggling and crawling which must be going on back there in lightless corridors. After a few moments, he regretted his thoughtless haste, and wished he had tried to follow backward the frescoes he had passed on the way in. True, they were so confused and duplicated that they could not have done him much good, but he wished none the less that he had made the attempt. Those he now saw were even more horrible than those that he had seen then, and he knew he was not in the corridors leading outside. In time, he had become quite sure he was not followed, and slackened his pace somewhat. But scarce had he breathed in half relief when a new peril beset him. His lamp was waning, and he would soon be in pitch blackness with no means of sight or guidance. When the light was all gone, he groped slowly in the dark, and prayed to the great ones for such help as they might afford. At times he felt the stone door sloping up or down, and once he stumbled over a step for which no reason seemed to exist. The farther he went, the damper it seemed to be, and when he was able to feel a junction, or the mouth of a side passage, he always chose the way which sloped downward the least. He believed, though, that his general course was down, and the vault-like smell and incrustations on the greasy walls and floor alike warned him that he was burrowing deep in Lang's unwholesome tableland. But there was not any warning of the thing which came at last, only the thing itself with its terror and shock and breathtaking chaos. One moment he was groping slowly over the slippery floor of an almost level place, and the next he was shooting dizzily downward in the dark through a burrow which must have been well nigh vertical. Of the length of that hideous sliding he could never be sure, but it seemed to take hours of delirious nausea and ecstatic frenzy. Then he realized he was still, with the phosphorescent clouds of a northern night shining sickly above him. All around were crumbling walls and broken columns, and the pavement on which he lay was pierced by straggling grass and wrenched asunder by frequent shrubs and roots. Behind him a basalt cliff rose topless and perpendicular, its dark sides sculptured into repellent scenes, and pierced by an arched and carven entrance to the inner blackness out of which he had come. Ahead stretched double rows of pillars, and the fragments and pedestals of pillars that spoke of a broad and bygone street. And from the urns and basins along the way he knew it had been a great street of gardens. Far off at its end the pillars spread to mark a vast round plaza, and in that open circle there loomed gigantic under the lurid night clouds a pair of monstrous things. Huge winged lions of diorite they were, with blackness and shadow between them. Full 20 feet they reared their grotesque and unbroken heads, and snarled derisive on the ruins around them. And Carter knew right well what they must be, for legend tells of only one such twain. They were the changeless guardians of the great abyss, and these dark ruins were in truth primordial Sarkomond. Carter's first act was to close and barricade the archway in the cliff with fallen blocks and odd debris that lay around. He wished no follower from Ling's hateful monastery, for along the way ahead would lurk enough of other dangers. Of how to get from Sarkomond to the peopled parts of Dreamland he knew nothing at all. Nor could he gain much by descending to the grottos of the ghouls, since he knew they were no better informed than he. The three ghouls which had helped him through the city of Gugs to the outer world had not known how to reach Sarkomond in their journey back, but had planned to ask old traitors in Dilothleen. He did not like to think of going again to the subterrane world of Gugs, and risking once more that hellish tower of Koth, with its cyclopean steps leading to the enchanted wood. Yet he felt he might have to try this course if all else failed. Over Lang's plateau, past the lone monastery, he dared not go unaided, for the high priest's emissaries must be many, while at the journey's end there would no doubt be the Shantax, and perhaps other things to deal with. If he could get a boat, he might sail back to Inganok past the jagged and hideous rock in the sea, for the primal frescoes in the monastery labyrinth had shown that this frightful place lies not far from Sarkomond's basalt quays. But to find a boat in this eon and deserted desert was no probable thing, and it did not appear likely that he could ever make one. Such were the thoughts of Randolph Carter, when a new impression began beating upon his mind. All this while there had stretched before him the great corpse-like width of fabled Sarkomond, with its black broken pillars and crumbling sphinx-crowned gates, and titan stones and monstrous winged lions against the sickly glow of those luminous night clouds. Now he saw far ahead and on the right a glow that no clouds could account for, and knew that he was not alone in the silence of that dead city. The glow rose and fell fitfully, flickering with a greenish tinge which did not reassure the watcher. And when he crept closer, down that littered street and through some narrow gaps between tumbled walls, he perceived that it was a campfire near the wharves, and with many vague forms clustered darkly around it, and a lethal odor hanging heavy over all. Beyond was the oily lapping of the harbor water with a great ship riding at anchor, and Carter paused in stark terror when he saw that the ship was indeed one of the dreaded black galleys from the moon. Then, just as he was about to creep back from that detestable flame, he saw a stirring among the vague dark forms and heard a peculiar and unmistakable sound. It was the frightened meeping of a ghoul, and in a moment it had swelled to a veritable chorus of anguish. Secure as he was in the shadow of a monstrous ruin, Carter allowed his curiosity to conquer his fear, and crept forward again instead of retreating. Once in a crossing on an open street he wriggled worm-like on his stomach, and in another place he had to rise to his feet to avoid making a noise among heaps of fallen marble. But always he succeeded in avoiding discovery, so that in a short time he had found a spot behind a Titan pillar whence he could watch the whole green-litten scene of action. There, around a hideous fire fed by the obnoxious stems of lunar fungi, there squatted a stinking circle of the toad-like moon beasts and their almost human slaves. Some of these slaves were heating curious iron spears in the leaping flames, and at intervals applying their white-hot points to the three lightly trussed prisoners that lay writhing before the leaders of the party. From the motions of their tentacles, Carter could see that the blunt-snouted moon-beasts were enjoying this spectacle hugely, and vast was his horror when he suddenly recognized the frantic meeping, and knew that the tortured ghouls were none other than the faithful trio which had guided him safely from the abyss, and had thereafter set out from the enchanted wood to find Sarcomod and the gate to their native depths. The number of malodorous moon-beasts about that greenish fire was very great, and Carter saw that he could do nothing now to save his former allies. Of how the ghouls had been captured he could not guess, but fancied that the grey toad-like blasphemies had heard them inquire in Dialath Lane concerning the way to Sarcomod, and had not wished them to approach so closely the hateful plateau of Leng and the high priest not to be described. For a moment he pondered on what he ought to do, and recalled how near he was to the gate of the ghouls' black kingdom. Clearly it was wisest to creep east to the plaza of Twin Lions, and descend at once to the gulf, where assuredly he would meet no horrors worse than those above, and where he might soon find ghouls eager to rescue their brethren, and perhaps to wipe out the moon-beasts from the black galley. It occurred to him that the portal, like other gates to the abyss, might be guarded by a flock of night gaunts, but he did not fear those faceless creatures now. He had learned that they are bound by solemn treaties with the ghouls, and the ghoul which was Pickman had taught him how to glibber a password they understood. So Carter began another silent crawl through the ruins, edging slowly towards the great central plaza and the winged lines. It was ticklish work, but the moon-beasts were pleasantly busy, and did not hear the slight noises which he twice made by accident amongst the scattered stones. At last he reached the open space, and picked his way among the stunted trees and briars that had grown up therein. The gigantic lions loomed terrible above him in the sickly glow of the phosphorescent night clouds, but he manfully persisted towards them, and presently crept round their faces, knowing it was on that side he would find the mighty darkness which they guard. 10 feet apart crouched the mocking-faced beasts of diorite, brooding on cyclopean pedestals whose sides were chiseled into fearsome bas-reliefs. Betwixt them was a tiled court with a central space, which had once been railed with balusters of onyx. Midway in this space a black well opened, and Carter soon saw that he had indeed reached the yawning gulf, whose crusted and moldy stone steps lead down towards the crypts of nightmare. Terrible is the memory of that dark descent, in which hours wore themselves away, while Carter wound sightlessly round and round down a fathomless spiral of steep and slippery stairs. So worn and narrow were the steps, and so greasy with the ooze of inner earth, that the climber never quite knew when to expect a breathless fall, and hurtling down to the ultimate pits. And he was likewise uncertain just when or how the guardian night gaunts would suddenly pounce upon him, if indeed there were any stationed in this primeval passage. All about him was a stifling odor of nether gulfs, and he felt that the air of these choking depths was not made for mankind. In time he became very numb and solemnant, moving more from automatic impulse than from reasoned will, nor did he realize any change when he stopped moving altogether as something quietly seized him from behind. He was flying very rapidly through the air before a malevolent tickling told him that the rubbery night gaunts had performed their duty. Awakened to the fact that he was in the cold, damp clutch of the faceless flutterers, Carter remembered the password of the ghouls, and glibbered it as loudly as he could amidst the wind and chaos of flight. Mindless though night gaunts are said to be, the effect was instantaneous, for all tickling stopped at once, and the creatures hastened to shift their captive to a more comfortable position. Thus encouraged, Carter ventured some explanations, telling of the seizure and torture of 3 ghouls by the moon beasts, and the need of assembling a party to rescue them. The night gaunts, though inarticulate, seemed to understand what was said, and showed greater haste and purpose in their flight. Suddenly, the dense blackness gave place to the gray twilight of inner earth, and there opened up ahead one of those flat sterile plains on which the ghouls loved to squat and gnaw. Scattered tombstones and osseous fragments told of the denizens of that place, and as Carter gave a loud meep of urgent summons, a score of burrows emptied forth their leathery, dog-like tenants. The night gaunts now flew low and set their passenger upon his feet, afterwards withdrawing a little and forming a hunched semicircle on the ground, while the ghouls greeted the newcomer. Carter glibbered his message rapidly and explicitly to the grotesque company, and 4 of them at once departed through different burrows to spread the news to others, and gather such troops as might be available for the rescue. After a long wait, a ghoul of some importance appeared, and made significant signs to the night gaunts, causing 2 of the later to fly off into the dark. Therefore there were constant accessions to the hunched flock of night gaunts on the plains, till at length the slimy soil was fairly black with them. Meanwhile, fresh ghouls crawled out of the burrows one by one, all glibbering excitedly and forming in crude battle array not far from the huddled night gaunts. In time there appeared that proud and influential ghoul which was once the artist Richard Pickman of Boston, and to him Carter glibbered a very full account of what had occurred. The erstwhile Pickman, surprised to greet his ancient friend again, seemed very much impressed, and held a conference with the other chiefs, a little apart from the growing throng. Finally, after scanning the ranks with care, the assembled chiefs all meeped in unison, and began glibbering orders to the crowd of ghouls and night gaunts. A large detachment of the horned flyers vanished at once, while the rest grouped themselves 2 by 2 on their knees with extended forelegs, awaiting the approach of the ghouls one by one. As each ghoul reached the pair of night gaunts to which he was assigned, he was taken up and borne away into the blackness, till at last the whole throng had vanished, save for Carter, Pickman, and the other chiefs, and a few pairs of night gaunts. Pickman explained that night gaunts are the advance guard, and battle steeds of the ghouls, and that the army was issuing forth to Sarkomand to deal with the moon beasts. Then Carter and the ghoulish chiefs approached the waiting bearers and were taken up by the damp, slippery page. Another moment, and all were whirling in wind and darkness, endlessly up, 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 to the gate of the winged lions and the spectral ruins, of primal Sarkomond. When, after a great interval, Carter saw again the sickly light of Sarkomond's nocturnal sky, it was to behold the great central plaza swarming with militant ghouls and night-gaunts. Day, he felt sure, must be almost due, but so strong was the army that no surprise of the enemy would be needed. The greenish flare near the wharf still glimmered faintly, though the absence of ghoulish meeping showed that the torture of the prisoners was over for the nonce. Softly glimmering directions to their steeds, and to the flock of riderless night-gaunts ahead, the ghouls presently rose in wide-whirring columns and swept on over the bleak ruins towards the evil flame. Carter was now beside Pickman in the front rank of ghouls, and saw as they approached the noisome camp that the moon beasts were totally unprepared. The three prisoners lay bound and inert beside the fire, while their toad-like captors slumped drowsily about in no certain order. The almost human slaves were asleep, even the sentinels shirking a duty which in this realm must have seemed to them merely perfunctory. The final swoop of the night-gaunts and mounted ghouls was very sudden, and each of the grayish toad-like blasphemies and their almost human slaves being seized by a group of night-gaunts before a sound was made. The moon beasts, of course, were voiceless, and even the slaves had little chance to scream before rubbery paws choked them into silence. Horrible were the writhings of those great jellyfish abnormalities as the sardonic night-gaunts clutched them, but nothing availed against the strength of those black prehensile talons. When a moon beast writhed too violently, a night-gaunt would seize and pull its quivering pink tentacles, which seemed to hurt so much that the victim would cease its struggles. Carter expected to see much slaughter, but found that the ghouls were far subtler in their plans. They delivered certain simple orders to the night-gaunts which held the captives, trusting the rest to instinct, and soon the hapless creatures were borne silently away into the great abyss, to be distributed impartially amongst the beholes, gugs, ghasts, and other dwellers in darkness whose modes of nourishment are not painless for their chosen victim. Meanwhile, the three bound ghouls had been released, and consoled by their conquering kinsfolk. So this is twice now that Carter has sort of led an opposing army to defeat their enemies, and is very funny. Carter, anxious to preserve a means of access to the rest of Dreamland, urged them not to sink the anchored galley, and this request was freely granted out of gratitude for his act in reporting the plight of the captured trio. On the ship were found some very curious objects and decorations, some which Carter cast at once into the sea. Ghouls and night-gaunts now formed themselves in separate groups, the former questioning their rescued fellows about past happenings. It appeared that the three had followed Carter's directions and proceeded from the enchanted wood to Dylath by way of Near in the sky, stealing human clothes at a lonely farmhouse and loping as closely as possible in the fashion of a man's walk. In Dylath taverns, their grotesque ways and faces had aroused much comment, but they had persisted in asking the way to Sarkomond until at last an old traveler was able to tell them. Then they knew that only a ship for Lilag Ling would serve their purpose, and prepared to wait patiently for such a vessel. But evil spies had doubtless reported much, for shortly a black galley put into port, and the wide-mouthed ruby merchants invited the ghouls to drink with them in a tavern. Wine was produced from one of those sinister bottles, grotesquely carven from a single ruby, and after that the ghouls found themselves prisoners in the black galley, as Carter had once found himself. This time, however, the unseen rowers steered not for the moon, but for antique Sarkomond, bent evidently on taking their captives before the high priest, not to be described. They had touched at the jagged rock in the northern sea, which Inganok's mariners shun, and the ghoul had there seen for the first time the real masters of the ship, being sickened despite their own callousness by such extremes of malign shapelessness and fearsome odor. There, too, were witnessed the nameless pastimes of the toad-like resident garrison, such pastime as to give rise to the night howlings which men fear, After that had come the landing at ruined Sarkomond and the beginning of the tortures, whose continuance the present rescue had prevented. Future plans were next discussed. The three rescued ghouls suggested a raid on the jagged rock and the extermination of the toad-like garrison there. To this, however, the night gaunts objected, since the prospect of flying over water did not please them. Most of the ghouls favored the design, but were at a loss how to follow it without the help of the winged night gaunts. Thereupon, Carter, seeing that they could not navigate the anchored galley, offered to teach them the use of the great banks of oars, to which proposal they eagerly assented. Gray day had now come, and under that leaden northern sky a picked detachment of ghouls filed into the noisome ship and took their seats on the rowers' benches. Carter found them fairly apt at learning, and before night had risked several experimental trips around the harbor. Not till 3 days later, however, did he deem it safe to attempt the voyage of conquest. Then, the rowers trained, and the night gaunts safely stowed in the forecastle, the party set sail at last. Pickman and the other chiefs gathering on deck and discussing modes of approach and procedure. On the very first night, the howlings from the rock were heard. Such was their timber that all the galley's crew shook visibly, but most of all trembled the three rescued ghouls who knew precisely what those howlings meant. It was not thought best to attempt an attack by night, so the ship lay to under the phosphorescent clouds to wait for the dawn of a grayish day. When the light was ample and the howlings still, the rowers resumed their strokes, and the galley drew closer and closer to that jagged rock, whose granite pinnacles clawed fantastically at the dull sky. The sides of the rock were very steep, but on ledges here and there could be seen the bulging walls of queer windowless dwellings, and the low railings guarded traveling high roads. No ship of men had ever come so near the place, or at least had never come so near and departed again, but Carter and the ghouls were void of fear and kept inflexibly on, rounding the eastern face of the rock and seeking the wharves which the rescue trio described as being on the southern side, within a harbor formed of steep headlands. The headlands were prolongations of the island proper, and came so closely together that only one ship at a time might pass between them. There seemed to be no watchers on the outside, so the galley was steered boldly through the flume-like strait and into the stagnant, fetid harbor beyond. Here, however, all was bustle and activity, with several ships lying at anchor along a forbidden stone quay, and scores of almost human slaves and moonbeasts by the waterfront handling crates and boxes, or driving nameless and fabulous horrors hitched to lumbering lorries. There was a small stone town hewn out of the vertical cliff above the wharfs, with the start of a winding road that spiraled out of town toward higher ledges of the rock. Of what lay inside that prodigious peak of granite none might say, but the things once saw on the outside were far from encouraging. At sight of the oncoming galley, the crowds on the wharves displayed much eagerness, those with eyes staring intently, and those without eyes wringing their pink tentacles expectantly. They did not, of course, realize that the black ship had changed hands, for ghouls look much like the horned and almost hooved humans, and the night gaunts were all out of sight below. By this time the leaders had fully formed a plan, which was to loose the night gaunts as soon as the wharf was touched, and then to sail directly away, leaving matters wholly to the instincts of those almost mindless creatures. Marooned on the rock, the horned flyers would first of all seize whatever living things they found there, and afterwards, quite helpless to think in terms of the homing instinct, would forget their fear of water and fly swiftly back to the abyss, bearing their noisome prey to appropriate destinations in the dark, from which naught would emerge alive again. The ghoul that was Pickman now went below and gave the night gaunts their simple instructions, while the ship drew very near to the ominous and malodorous wharves. Presently a fresh stir rose along the waterfront, and Carter saw that the motions of the galley had began to excite suspicion. Evidently the steersman was not making for the right dock, and probably the watchers had noticed the difference between the hideous ghouls, and the almost human slaves whose places they were taking. Some silent alarm must have been given, for almost at once a horde of the mephitic moon beasts began to pour from the little black doorways of the windowless houses and down the winding road at night. A rain of curious javelins struck the galley as the prow hit the wharf, felling 2 ghouls and slightly wounding another. But at this point all the hatches were thrown open to emit a black cloud of whirring night gaunts, which swarmed over the town like a flock of horned and cyclopean bats. The jellyfish moon beasts had procured a great pole, and were trying to push off the invading ship, but when the night gaunts struck them, they thought of such things no more. It was a very terrible spectacle to see those faceless and rubbery ticklers at their pastime, and tremendously impressive to watch the dense cloud of them spreading through the town and up the winding roadway to the reaches above. Sometimes a group of the black flutterers would drop a toad-like prisoner from aloft by mistake, and the manner in which the victim would burst was highly offensive to the sight and the smell. When the last of the night gaunts had left the galley, the ghoulish leaders delivered an order of withdrawal, and the rowers pulled quietly out of the harbor between the gray headlands, while still the town was a chaos of battle and conquest. The Pickman ghoul allowed several hours for the night gaunts to make up their rudimentary minds and overcome their fear of flying over the sea, and kept the galley standing about a mile off the jagged rock while he waited and dressed the wounds of the injured men. Night fell, and the gray twilight gave place to the sickly phosphorescence of low clouds, and all the while the leaders watched the high peaks of that accursed rock for signs of the night gaunt's flight. Towards morning, a black speck was seen hovering timidly over the topmost pinnacle, and shortly afterward the speck had become a swarm. Just before daybreak the swarm seemed to scatter, and within a quarter of an hour it had vanished wholly in the distance towards the northeast. Once or twice something seemed to fall from the thinning swarm into the sea, but Carter did not worry, since he knew from observation that the toad-like moon beasts cannot swim. At length, when the ghouls were satisfied that all the night gaunts had left for Sarkomond and the great abyss with their doomed burdens, the galley put back into the harbor betwixt the gray headlands, and all the hideous company landed and roamed curiously over the denuded rock with its towers and eyries and fortresses, chiseled from the solid stone. Frightful were the secrets uncovered in those evil and windowless crypts, for the remnants of unfinished pastimes were many, and in various stages of departure from their primal state. Carter put out of the way certain things which were after a fashion alive, and fled precipitately from a few other things about which he could not be very positive. The stench-filled houses were furnished mostly with grotesque stools and benches carven from moon trees, and were painted inside with nameless and frantic designs. Countless weapons, implements, and ornaments lay about, including some large idols of solid ruby, depicting singular beings not found on earth. These later did not, despite their material, invite either appropriation or long inspection, and Carter took the trouble to hammer 5 of them into very small pieces. The scattered spears and javelins he collected, and with Pickman's approval distributed among the ghouls. Such devices were new to the dog-like lopers, but their relative simplicity made them easy to master after a few concise hints. The upper parts of the rock held more temples than private homes, and in numerous hewn chambers were found terrible carven altars and doubtfully stained fonts and shrines for the worship of things more monstrous than the mild gods atop Kadath. From the rear of one great temple stretched a low black passage, which Carter followed far into the rock. With a torch he came to a lightless domed hall of vast proportions, whose vaultings were covered with demonic carvings, and in whose center yawned a foul and bottomless well, like that in the hideous monastery of Lang, where broods alone the high priest not to be described. On the distant shadowy side, beyond the noisome well, he thought he discerned a small door of strangely wrought bronze, but for some reason he felt an unaccountable dread of opening it, or even approaching it, and hastened back through the cavern to his unlovely allies, as they shambled about with an ease and abandon he could scarcely feel. The ghouls had observed the unfinished pastimes of the moon beasts, and had profited in their fashion. They had also found a hogsheet of potent moon wine, and were rolling it down to the wharves for removal and later use in diplomatic dealings, though the rescue trio, remembering its effect on them in Dilethlene, had warned their company to taste none of it. Of rubies from lunar mines there was a great store, both rough and polished, in one of the vaults near the water, but when the ghouls found they were not good to eat, they lost all interest in them. Carter did not try to carry any away, since he knew too much about those which had mined them. Suddenly there came an excited meeping from the sentries on the wharfs, and all the loathsome foragers turned from their task to stare seaward and cluster round the waterfront. Betwixt the grey headlands a fresh black galley was rapidly advancing, and it could be but a moment before the almost humans on deck would perceive the invasion of the town and give the alarm to the monstrous things below. Fortunately, the ghouls still bore the spears and the javelins which Carter had distributed among them, and, at his command, sustained by the being that was Pickman, they now formed a line of battle and prepared to prevent the landing of the ship. Presently, a burst of excitement on the galley told of the crew's discovery of the changed state of things, and the instant stoppage of the vessel proved that the superior numbers of the ghouls had been noted and taken into account. After a moment of hesitation, the newcomers silently turned and passed out between the headlands again. But not for an instant did the ghouls imagine that the conflict was averted. Either the dark ship would seek reinforcements, or the crew would try to land elsewhere on the island. Hence a party of scouts was at once sent up towards the pinnacle to see what the enemy's course would be. In a very few minutes a ghoul returned, breathless, to say that the moon beasts and almost humans were landing on the outside of the more easterly of the rugged grey headlands, and descending by hidden paths and ledges which a goat could scarcely tread in safety. Almost immediately afterwards the galley was sighted again through the flume-like strait, but only for a second. Then, a few moments later, a second messenger panted down from aloft to say that another party was landing on the other headland, both being much more numerous than the size of the galley would seem to allow for. The ship itself, moving slowly with only one sparsely manned tier of oars, soon hove in sight betwixt the cliffs, and lay to in the fetid harbor as if to watch the coming fray, and stand by for any possible use. By this time Carter and Pickman had divided the ghouls into 3 parties, one to meet each of the 2 invading columns, and one to remain in the town. The first 2 at once scrambled up to the rocks in their respective directions, while the third was subdivided into a land party and a sea party. The sea party, commanded by Carter, boarded the anchored galley and rowed out to meet the undermanned galley of the newcomers, whereat the latter retreated through the strait to the open sea. Carter did not at once pursue it, for he knew he might be needed more acutely near the town. Meanwhile, the frightful detachments of the moon beasts and almost humans had lumbered up to the top of the headlands, and were shockingly silhouetted on either side against the grey twilight sky. The thin, hellish flutes of the invaders had now begun to whine, and the general effect of those hybrid, half-amorphous processions was as nauseating as the actual odor given off by the toad-like lunar blasphemies. Then the 2 parties of the ghouls swarmed into sight and joined the silhouetted panorama. Javelins began to fly from both sides, and the swelling meeps of the ghouls and the bestial howls of the almost humans gradually joined the hellish whines of the flutes to form a frantic and indescribable chaos of demon cacophony. Now and then bodies fell from the narrow ridges of the headlands into the sea outside of the harbor inside, in the later case being subdued quickly under by certain submarine lurkers, whose presence was indicated only by prodigious bubbles. For half an hour this dual battle raged in the sky, till upon the west cliff the invaders were completely annihilated. On the east cliff, however, where the leader of the Moon Beast party appeared to be present, the ghouls had not fared so well, and were slowly retreating to the slopes of the pinnacle proper. Pickman had ordered reinforcements for this front from the party in the town, and these had helped greatly in the earlier stages of the combat. Then, when the western battle was over, the victorious survivors hastened across to the arid of their hard-pressed fellows, turning the tide and forcing the invaders back again along the narrow ridge of the headland. The almost humans were by this time all slain, but the last of the toad-like horrors fought desperately with the great spears clutched in their powerful and disgusting jaws. The time for javelins was now nearly past, and the fight became a hand-to-hand contest of what few spearmen could meet upon that narrow ridge. As the fury and recklessness increased, the number falling into the sea became very great. Those striking the harbor met nameless extinction from the unseen bubblers, but of those striking the open sea, some were able to swim to the foot of the cliffs and land on tidal rocks, while the hovering galley of the enemy rescued several moonbeasts. The cliffs were unscalable except where the monsters had debarked, so that none of the ghouls on the rocks could rejoin their battle line. Some were killed by javelins from the hostile galley or from the moonbeasts above, but a few survived to be rescued when the security of the land party seemed assured. Carter's galley sailed forth between the headlands and drove the hostile ship far out to sea, pausing to rescue such ghouls as were on the rocks or still swimming in the ocean. Several moonbeasts washed on rocks or reefs were speedily put out of the way. Finally, the moonbeast's galley was safely in the distance, and the invading land army concentrated in one place. Carter landed a considerable force on the eastern headland in the enemy's rear, after which the fight was short-lived indeed. Attacked from both sides, the noisome flounderers were rapidly cut to pieces or pushed into the sea, till by evening the ghoulish chiefs agreed that the island was again clear of them. The hostile galley, meanwhile, had disappeared, and it was decided that the evil jagged rock had better be evacuated before any overwhelming horde of lunar horrors might be assembled and brought against the victors. So by night, Pickman and Carter assembled all the ghouls and counted them with care, finding that over a fourth had been lost in the day's battles. The wounded were placed on bunks in the galley, for Pickman always discouraged the old ghoulish custom of killing and eating one's own wounded, and the able-bodied troops were assigned to the oars or to other such places as they might usually fill. Under the low phosphorescent clouds of night the galley sailed, and Carter was not sorry to be disparting from that island of unwholesome secrets, whose lightless domed hall with its bottomless well and repellent bronze door lingered restlessly in his fancy. Dawn found the ship in sight of Sarmalcon's ruined quays of basalt, where a few night-gaunt sentries still waited, squatting like black-horned gargoyles on the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of that fearful city which lived and died before the years of man. The ghouls made camp amongst the fallen stones of Sarkomand, dispatching a messenger for enough night-gaunts to serve them as steeds. Pickman and the other chiefs were effusive in their gratitude for the aid Carter had lent them, and Carter now began to feel that his plans were indeed maturing well, and that he would be able to command the help of these fearsome allies, not only in quitting this part of the dreamland, but in pursuing his ultimate quest for the gods atop unknown Kadath. And the marvelous sunset city they were so strangely withheld from his slumbers. Accordingly, he spoke of these things to the ghoulish leaders, telling what he knew of the cold waste wherein Kadath stands, and of the monstrous Shantax in the mountains carved into double-headed images which guard it. He spoke of the fear of the Shantax for the night gaunts, and of how the vast hippolycephic birds fly screaming from the black burrows high up on the gaunt gray peaks that divide Ingenak from hateful Lang. He spoke, too, of the things he had learnt concerning night gaunts from the frescoes in the windowless monastery of the high priests not to be described, how even the great ones fear them, and how their ruler, is not the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep at all, but hoary and immemorial Nodens, lord of the great abyss. All these things Carter glibbered to the assembled ghouls, and presently outlined that request which he had in mind, and which he did not think extravagant, considering the services he had so lately rendered the rubbery, dog-like lopers. He wished very much, he said, for the services of enough night-gaunts to bear him safely through the air, past the realm of Shantax and Carbon Mountains, and up into the cold waste beyond the returning track of any other mortal. He desired to fly to the Onyx Castle atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste, to plead with the Great Ones for the Sunset City they denied him, and felt sure that the night-gaunts could take him thither without trouble, high above the perils of the plain and over the hideous double heads of those carbon sentinel mountains, that squat eternally in the grey dusk. For the horned and faceless creatures there could be no danger from aught of earth, since the Great Ones themselves dread them. And even were unexpected things to come from the other gods, who are prone to oversee the affairs of earth's milder gods, the night-gaunts need not fear, for the outer hells are indifferent matters to such silent and slippery flyers as own not Nyarlathotep for their master, but bow only to potent and archaic Nodens. A flock of 10 or 15 night-gaunts, Carter glibbered, would surely be enough to keep any combination of Shantax in distance, though perhaps it might be well to have some ghouls in the party to manage the creatures, their ways being known better to their ghoulish allies than to men. The party could land him at some convenient point within whatever walls that fabulous onyx citadel might have, waiting in the shadows for his return or his signal, whilst he ventured inside the castle to give prayer to the gods of earth. If any ghouls choose to escort him into the throne room of the Great Ones, he would be thankful, for their presence would add weight and importance to his plea. He would not, however, insist upon this, but merely wished transportation to and from the castle atop unknown Kadath, the final journey being either to the marvelous Sunset City itself, in case the gods proved favorable, or back to the earthward gate of deep slumber in the enchanted wood in case his prayers were fruitless. Whilst Carter was speaking, all the ghouls listened with great attention, and as the moments advanced, the sky became black with clouds of those night-gaunts for which the messengers had been sent. The winged horrors settled in a semicircle around the ghoulish army, waiting respectfully as the dog-like chieftains considered the wish of the earthly traveler. The ghoul that was Pickman glibbered gravely with its fellows, and in the end Carter was offered far more than he had at most expected. As he had aided the ghouls in their conquest of the moon beasts, so would they aid him in his daring voyage to realms whence none had ever returned, lending him not merely a few of their allied night-gaunts, but their entire army as they encamped, veteran fighting ghouls and newly assembled night-gaunts alike, save only for a small garrison for the captured Black Galley and such spoils as had come from the jagged rock and the sea. They would set out through the air whenever he might wish, and once arrived in Kadath, a suitable train of ghouls would attend him in state as he placed his petition before Earth's gods in their onyx castle. Moved by a gratitude and a satisfaction beyond words, Carter made plans with the ghoulish leaders for his audacious voyage. The army would fly high, they decided, over hideous Lang, with its nameless monastery and wicked stone villages, stopping only at the vast gray peaks to confer with the Shantak frightening night-gaunts, whose burrows honeycombed their summits. They would then, according to what advice they might receive from those innocents, choose their final course, approaching unknown Kadath either through the desert of Carbon Mountains north of Inganak, or through the more northerly reaches of repulsive Lang itself. Dog-like and soulless as they are, the ghouls and night-gaunts had no dread of what those untrodden deserts might reveal, nor did they feel any deterring awe at the thought of Kadath towering lone with its onyx castle of mystery. About midday, The ghouls and the night gaunts prepared for flight, each ghoul selecting a suitable pair of horned steeds to bear him, and Carter was placed well up towards the head of the column besides Pickman, and in front of the whole a double line of riderless night gaunts was provided as a vanguard. At a brisk meep from Pickman, the whole shocking army rose in a nightmare cloud above the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of primordial Sarkomond, higher and higher, till even the great basalt cliff behind the town was cleared, and the cold, sterile table of Ling's outskirt laid open to sight. Still higher flew the black host, till even this tableland grew small beneath them, and as they worked northward over the windswept plateau of Har, Carter saw once again with a shudder the circle of crude monoliths and the squat windowless building which he knew held the frightful, silken-masked blasphemy from whose clutches he had so narrowly escaped. This time no descent was made as the army swept, bat-like, over the sterile landscape, passing the feeble fires of the unwholesome stone villages at a great altitude, and pausing not at all to mark the morbid twistings of the hooved, horned, almost humans that dance and pipe eternally therein. Once they saw a shantak bird flying low over the plain, but when it saw them it screamed noxiously and flapped off to the north in grotesque panic. At dusk they reached the jagged gray peaks that form the barrier of Inganok, and hovered about those strange caves near the summits, which Carter recalled as so frightfully to the Shantaks. At the insistent boom of the ghoulish leaders, there issued forth from each lofty burrow a stream of horned black flyers, which the ghouls and night gaunts of the party conferred at length by means of ugly gestures. It soon became clear that the best course would be that over the cold waste north of Inganok, for Lang's northward reaches are full of unseen pitfalls that even the night gaunts dislike. Abysmal influences centering in certain white hemispheric buildings on curious knolls, which common folklore associates unpleasantly with the outer gods, and their crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep. Of Kadath, the flutterers of the peaks knew almost nothing, save that there must be some mighty marvel toward the north, over which the Shantaks and their carbon mountains stand guard. They hinted at rumored abnormalities of proportion in those trackless leagues beyond, and recalled vague whispers of a realm where night broods eternally, but of definite data they had nothing to give. So Carter and his party thanked them kindly, and, crossing the topmost granite pinnacles to the skies of Inganok, dropped below the level of the phosphorescent night clouds, and beheld in the distance those terrible squatting gargoyles that were mountains till some hand had carved fright into their virgin rock. There they squatted, in hellish half-circle, their legs on the desert sand and their mitres piercing the luminous clouds, sinister and wolf-like, and double-headed with faces of fury and right hands raised, dully and malignly watching the rim of man's world, and guarding with horror the reaches of a cold northern world that is not man's. From their hideous laps rose evil Shantaks of elephantine bulk, but these all fled with insane titters as the vanguard of night gaunts was sighted in the misty sky. Northward, above those gargoyle mountains, the army flew, and over leagues of dim desert where never a landmark rose. Less and less luminous grew the clouds, till at length Carter could see only blackness around him. But never did the winged steeds falter, bred as they were in earth's blackest crypts, and seeing not with any eyes, but with the whole dank surface of their slippery forms. On and on they flew, past winds of dubious scent and sounds of dubious import, ever in thickness darkest, and covering such prodigious spaces that Carter wondered whether or not they could still be within Earth's dreamland. Then, suddenly, the clouds thinned, and the stars shone spectrally above. All below was still black, but those pallid beacons in the sky seemed alive with a meaning and directiveness they had never possessed elsewhere, It was not that the figures of the constellation were different, but that the same familiar shapes now revealed a certain significance they had formerly failed to make plain. Everything focused towards the north. Every curve and asterism of the glittering sky became part of a vast design whose function was to hurry the first eye and then the whole observer onward to some secret and terrible goal of convergence beyond the frozen waste that stretched endlessly ahead. Carter looked towards the east, where the great ridge of barrier peaks had towered along all the length of Inganok, and saw again the stars, a jagged silhouette which told of its continued presence. It was more broken now, with yawning clefts and fantastically erratic pinnacles, and Carter studied close the suggestive turns and inclinations of that grotesque outline, which seemed to share with the stars some subtle northward urge. They were flying past at a tremendous speed, so that the watcher had to strain hard to catch details, when all at once he beheld just above the line of the topmost peaks a dark and moving object against the stars, whose course exactly paralleled that of his own bizarre party. The ghouls had likewise glimpsed it, for he heard their low glibbering all about him, and for a moment he fancied the object was a gigantic shantak, of a size vastly greater than that of the average specimen. Soon, however, he saw that his theory would not hold, for the shape of the thing above the mountains was not that of any hippocephalic bird. Its outline against the stars, needlessly vague as it was, resembled rather some huge mitred head or pair of heads infinitely magnified, and its rapid bobbing flight through the sky seemed most peculiarly a wingless one. Carter could not tell which side of the mountains it was on, but soon perceived that it had parts below the parts he had first seen, since it blotted out all the stars and places where the ridge was deeply cleft. Then came a wide gap in the range, where the hideous reaches of Transmontane Lang were joined to the cold waste on this side by a low pass through which the stars shone wanly. Carter watched this gap with intense care, knowing that he might see outlined against the sky beyond it the lower parts of the vast thing that flew undulantly above the pinnacles. The object had now floated ahead a trifle, and every eye of the party was fixed on the rift where it would presently appear in full-length silhouette. Gradually, the huge thing above the peaks neared the gap, slightly slackening its speed, as if conscious of having outdistanced the ghoulish army. For another minute suspense was keen, and then the brief instant of full silhouette and revelation came, bringing to the lips of the ghouls an awed and half-choked "meep" of cosmic fear, and to the soul of the traveler a chill that has never wholly left it. For the mammoth, bobbing shape that overtopped the ridge was only a head, a mitred double head, and below it, in terrible vastness, loped the frightfully swollen body that bore it, the mountain-high monstrosity that walked in stealth and silence, the hyena-like distortion of a giant anthropoid shape that trotted blackly against the sky, its repulsive pair of cone-capped heads reaching halfway to the zenith. Carter did not lose consciousness, or even scream aloud, for he was an old dreamer, but he looked behind him in horror and shuddered when he saw that there were other monstrous heads silhouetted above the level of the peaks, bobbing along stealthily after the first one, and straight in the rear were three of the mighty mountain shapes seen full against the southern stars, tiptoeing wolf-like and lumberingly, their tall mitres nodding thousands of feet in the air. The carven mountains, then, had not stayed squatting in that rigid semicircle north of Inganak, with right hands uplifted. They had duties to perform, and were not remiss. But it was horrible that they never spoke, and never even made a sound in walking. Meanwhile, the ghoul that was Pickman had delivered an order to the night gaunts, and the whole army soared higher into the air. Up towards the stars the grotesque column shot, till nothing stood out any longer against the sky, neither the gray granite ridge that was still, nor the cavered and mitred mountains that walked. All was blackness beneath as the fluttering legion surged northwards amidst rushing winds and invisible laughter in the aether, and never a shantak or less mentionable entity rose from the haunted waste to pursue them. The farther they went, the faster they flew, till soon their dizzying speed seemed to pass that of a rifle ball and approach that of a planet in its orbit. Carter wondered how, with such speed, the earth could still stretch beneath them, but knew that in the land of dream dimensions have strange proportions. That they were in the realm of eternal night he felt certain, and he fancied that the constellations overhead had subtly emphasized their northward focus, gathering themselves up, as it were, to cast the flying army into the void of the boreal pole, as the folds of a bag are gathered up to cast out the last bits of substance therein. Then he noticed with terror that the wings of the night gaunts were not flapping any more. The horned and faceless steeds had folded their membranous appendages, and were resting quite passive in the chaos of wind that whirled and shuckled as it bore them on. A force not of earth had seized on the army, and ghouls and the night gaunts alike were powerless before a current which pulled madly and relentlessly into the north, whence no mortal had ever returned. At length a lone pallid light was seen on the skyline ahead, thereafter rising steadily as they approached, and having beneath it a black mass that blotted out the stars. Carter saw that it must be some beacon on a mountain, for only a mountain could rise so vast as seen from so prodigious a height in the air. Higher and higher rose the light and the blackness beneath it, till half the northern sky was obscured by the rugged conical mass. Lofty as the army was, that pale and sinister beacon arose above it, towering monstrous above all peaks and concernments of earth, and tasting the atomless aether where the cryptical moon and the mad planets reel. No mountain known of man was that which loomed above them. The high clouds far below were but a fringe for its foothills. The grasping dizziness of topmost air was but a girdle for its loins. Scornful and spectral climbed that bridge betwixt the earth and heaven, black in eternal night, and crowned with a patient of unknown stars, whose awful, insignificant outline drew every moment clearer. Ghouls leaped in wonder as they saw it, and Carter shivered in fear lest all the hurtling army be dashed to pieces on the unyielding onyx of that cyclopean cliff. Higher and higher rose the light, till it mingled with the loftiest orbs of the zenith, and winked down at the flyers with lurid mockery. All the north beneath it was blackness now, dread, stony blackness, from infinite depths to infinite heights, with only that pale winking beacon perched unreachably at the top of all vision. Carter studied the light more closely, and saw that at last what lines its inky background made against the stars. There were towers on that Titan mountain top, horrible domed towers and noxious and incalculable tiers, and clusters beyond any dreamable workmanship of man, battlements and terraces of wonder and menace, all limed, tiny and black and distant against the starry patient that glowed malevolently at the utmost rim of sight. Capping that most measureless of mountains was a castle beyond all mortal thought, and in it glowed the demon light. Then Randolph Carter knew that his quest was done, and that he saw above him the goal of all forbidden steps and audacious visions, the fabulous, the incredible home of the great ones atop unknown Kadath. Even as he realized this thing, Carter noticed a change in the course of the helplessly wind-sucked party. They were rising abruptly now, and it was plain that the focus of their flight was the Onyx Castle. So close was the great black mountain that its sides sped by them dizzily as they shot upward, and in the darkness they could discern nothing upon it. Faster and faster loomed the tenebrous towers of the nighted castle above, and Carter could see that it was well nigh blasphemous in its immensity. Well might its stones have been quarried by nameless workmen in that horrible gulf rent out of the rock in the hill pass north of Ingenag. For such was its size that a man on its threshold stood even as an ant on the steps of earth's loftiest fortress. The shint of unknown stars above the myriad domed turrets glowed with a sallow, sickly fire, so that a kind of twilight hung about the murky walls of slippery onyx. The solid rock now gave place to the giant foundations of the monstrous castle, and it seemed that the speed of the party was somewhat abated. Vast walls shot up, and there was a glimpse of a great gate through the voyagers were swept. All was night in the Titan courtyard, and then came the deeper blackness of inmost things as a huge arched portal engulfed the column. Vortices of cold wind surged dankly through sightless labyrinths of onyx, and Carter could never tell what cyclopean stairs and corridors lay silent amongst the rout. Always upward led the terrible plunge in darkness. Large as the army of ghouls and night gaunts was, it was lost in the prodigious voids of that more than earthly castle. And when at last there suddenly dawned around him the lurid light of that single tower room, whose lofty window had served as a beacon, it took Carter long to discern the far walls and high, distant ceiling, and to realize that he was indeed not again in the boundless air outside. Randolph Carter had hoped to come into the throne room of the great ones with poise and dignity, flanked and followed by impressive lines of ghouls in ceremonial order, and offering his prayer as a free and potent master among dreamers. He had known that the great ones themselves are not beyond a mortal's power to cope with, and had trusted to luck that the other gods and their crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep, would not happen to come to their aid at the crucial moment, as they had so often done before when men sought out earth's gods in their home or on their mountains. And with his hordiest escort he had hoped to defy even the other gods if need were, knowing as he did that ghouls have no masters, and that night gaunts own not Nyarlathotep, but only archaic Nodens for their lord. But now he saw that supernal Kadath in its cold waste is indeed girt with dark wonders and nameless sentinels, and that the other gods are of a surely vigilant in guarding the mild, feeble gods of earth. Void as they are of lordship over ghouls and night gaunts, the mindless, shapeless blasphemies of outer space can yet control them when they must, so that it was not in state as a free and potent master of dreamers that Randolph Carter came into the great one's throne room with his ghouls, swept and herded by nightmare tempests from the stars, and dogged by unseen horrors of the northern waste. All that army floated captive and helpless in the lurid light, dropping numbly to the onyx floor when by some voiceless order the winds of fright dissolved. Before no golden dais had Randolph Carter come, nor was there any august circle of crowned and haloed beings with narrow eyes, long-lobed ears, thin nose, and pointed chin, whose kinship to the carven face on Nagranac might stamp them as those to whom a dreamer might pray, save for that one tower room, the Onyx Castle. Atop Kadath was dark, and the masters were not there. Carter had come to unknown Kadath in the cold waste, but he had not found the gods. Yet still the lurid light glowed in that one tower room, whose size was so little less than all of outdoors, and whose distant walls and roof were so nearly lost to sight in thin curling mists. Earth's gods were not there, it was true, but of subtler and less visible presences there could be no doubt. Where the mild gods are absent, the other gods are not unrepresented, and certainly the onyx castle of castles was far from tenantless. In what outrageous form or forms terror would next reveal itself, Carter could by no means imagine. He felt that his visit had been expected, and wondered how close of a watch had all along been kept upon him by the crawling chaos. Nyarlathotep. It is Nyarlathotep, horror of infinite shapes, and dread soul and messenger of the other gods that the fungus moon beasts serve. And Carter thought of the black galley that had vanished when the tide of battle turned against the toad-like abnormalities on the jagged rock and the sea. Reflecting upon these things, he was staggering to his feet in the midst of his nightmare company, when there rang without warning through that pale-litten and limitless chamber the hideous blast of a demon trumpet. 3 times pealed that frightfully brazen scream, and when the echoes of the third blast had died chuckling away, Randolph Carter saw that he was alone. Whither, why, and how the ghouls and night-gaunts had been snatched from sight was not for him to divine. He knew only that he was suddenly alone, and that whatever unseen powers lurked mockingly around him were no powers of earth's friendly dreamland. Presently, from the chamber's utmost reaches a new sound came. This, too, was a rhythmic trumpeting, but of a kind far removed from the 3 raucous blasts. Odors of incense came to match the golden notes, and overhead a great light dawned, its colors changing in cycles unknown to Earth's spectrum, and followed the song of the trumpet in weird symphonic harmonies. Torches flared in the distance, and the beat of drums throbbed nearer amidst waves of tense expectancy. Out of the flitting mists and the cloud of strange incense filed twin columns of giant black slaves with loincloths of iridescent silk. Upon their heads were strapped vast helmet-like torches of glittering metal, from which the fragrance of obscure balsams spread in fumous spirals. In their right hands were crystal wands whose tips were carven into leering chimeras, while their left hands grasped long, thin silver trumpets which they blew in turn. Armlets and anklets of gold they had, and between each pair of anklets stretched a golden chain that held its wearer to a silver gate. That they were true black men of Earth's dreamland was at once apparent, but it seemed less likely that their rites and costumes were holy things of our Earth. 10 feet from Carter, the columns stopped, and as they did so, each trumpet flew abruptly to its bearer's thick lips. Wild and ecstatic was the blast that followed, and wilder still the cry that chorused just after the dark throats somehow made shrill by strange artifice. Then, down the wide lane, betwixt the 2 columns, a lone figure strode, a tall, slim figure, with the young face of an antique pharaoh, gay with prismatic robes and crowned with a golden shent that glowed with inherent light. Close up, Carter strode that regal figure, whose proud carriage and swart features had in them the fascination of a dark god or fallen archangel, and around whose eyes there lurked the languid sparkle of capricious humor. It spoke, and in its mellow tones there rippled the mild music of Lethen streams. "Randolph Carter," said the voice, "you have come to see the great ones whom it is unlawful for men to see. Watchers have spoken of this thing, and the other gods have grunted as they rolled and tumbled mindlessly to the sound of thin flutes in the black ultimate void where broods the demon sultan whose name no lips dare speak. When Barzai the Wise climbed Hagath Claw to see the great ones dance and howl above the clouds in the moonlight, he never returned. The other gods were there too, and they did what was expected. Zenig of Aphrat sought to reach unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and his skull is now set in a ring on the little finger of one whom I need not name. But you, Randolph Carter, have braved all things of Earth's dreamland, and burn still with the flame of quest. You came not as one curious, but one seeking his due. Nor have you failed ever in reverence towards the mild gods of earth. Yet have these gods kept you from the marvelous sunset city of your dreams. And wholly through their own small covetousness, for verily they crave the weird loveliness of that which your fancy has fashioned, and vowed that henceforth no other spot should be their abode. They are gone from their castle on unknown Kadath to dwell in your marvelous city. All through its palaces of veined marble they revel by day, and when the sun sets they go out in the perfumed gardens and watch the golden glory on temples and colonnades, arched bridges, and silver-basined fountains, and the wide streets with blossom-laden urns, and ivory statues in gleaming rows. And when night comes they climb tall terraces in the dew, and sit on carved benches of porphyry scanning the stars, or lean over pale balustrades to gaze at the town's steep northward slopes, where one by one the little windows and old peaked gables shine softly out with the calm yellow light of homely candles. The gods love your marvelous city, and walk no more in the ways of the gods. They have forgotten the high places of earth, and the mountains that knew their youth. The earth has no longer any gods that are gods, and only the other ones from outer space hold sway on unremembered Kadath. Far away in the valley of your own childhood, Randolph Carter, play the heedless great ones. You have dreamed too well, O wise arch-dreamer, for you have drawn dreams' gods away from the world of all men's visions to that which is wholly yours, having builded out of your boyhood's small fancies a city more lovely than all the phantoms which have gone before. It is not well that earth's gods leave their thrones for the spider to spin on, and their realm for the others to sway in the dark manner of others. Fain would the powers from outside bring chaos and horror to you, Randolph Carter, who are the cause of their upsetting, but that they know it is by you alone that the gods may be sent back to their world, in that half-waking dreamland which is yours. No power of utmost night may pursue, and only you can send the selfish great ones gently out of your marvelous sunset city, back through the northern twilight to their wonted place atop unknown Kadath in the golden waste. So, Randolph Carter, in the name of the other gods, I spare you, and charge you to serve my will. I charge you to seek that sunset city which is yours, and to send thence the drowsy truant gods for whom the dream world waits. Not hard to find is that roseal fever of the gods, that fanfare of supernal trumpets and clash of immortal cymbals, that mystery whose place and meaning have haunted you through the halls of waking and the gulfs of dreaming, and tormented you with hints of vanished memory and the pain of lost things awesome and momentous. Not hard to find is that symbol and relic of your days of wonder, for truly it is but the stable and eternal gem wherein all that wonder sparkles crystallized to light your evening path. Behold, it is not over unknown seas, but back over well-known years, that your quest must go, back to the bright strange things of infancy, and the quick sun-drenched glimpses of magic, that old scenes brought to wide young eyes. For you know that your gold and marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth. It is the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows aflame with sunset, of the flower-fragrant common and the great dome on the hill, and the tangle of gables and chimneys in the violet valley where the many-bridged Charles flows drowsily. These things you saw, Randolph Carter, when your nurse first wheeled you out in the springtime, and they will be the last things you will ever see with eyes of memory and love. And there is antique Salem with its brooding years and spectral marble heads, scaling its rocky precipices into past centuries, and the glory of Salem's towers and spires seen afar from Marblehead's pastures, across the harbor against the setting sun. There is Providence, quaint and lordly, on its 7 hills over the blue harbor, with terraces of green leading up to steeples and citadels of living antiquity, and Newport climbing wraith-like from its dreaming breakwater. Arkham is there, with its moss-grown gambrel roofs, and the rock-rolling meadows behind it, and antediluvian Kingsport, hoary with stacked chimneys and deserted quays and overhanging gables, and the marvel of high cliffs and the milky misted ocean with toiling buoys beyond, cool vales in Concord, cobbled lanes in Portsmouth, twilight bends of rustic New Hampshire roads, where giant elms half hide white farmhouse walls and creaking well sweeps, Gloucester's salt wharfs and Truro's windy willows, vistas of distant steepled towns and hills, beyond hills, along the north shore, husked stony slopes, and low ivied cottages in the lee of huge boulders in Rhode Island's back country, scent of the sea and fragrance of the fields, spell of the dark woods, and joy of the orchards and gardens at dawn. These, Randolph Carter, are your city, for they are yourself. New England bore you, and into your soul she poured a liquid loveliness which cannot die. This loveliness, molded, crystallized, and polished by years of memory and dreaming, is your terraced wonder of elusive sunsets. And to find that marbled parapet with curious urns and carven rail, and descend at last those endless balustraded steps to the city of broad squares and prismatic fountains, you need only to turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Look! Through that window shine the stars of eternal night. Even now they are shining above the scenes you have known and cherished, drinking of their charm that they may shine more lovely over the gardens of dream. There is Antares. He is winking at this moment over the roofs of Tremont Street, and you could see him from your window on Beacon Hill. Out beyond those stars, yon the gulfs from whence my mindless masters have sent me. Some day you too may traverse them, but if you are wise you will beware such folly, for those mortals who have been and returned, only one preserves a mind unshattered by the pounding, clawing horrors of the void. Terrors and blasphemies gnaw at one another for space, and there is more evil in the lesser ones than in the greater, even as you know from the deeds of those who sought to deliver you into my hands, whilst I myself harbored no wish to shatter you, and would indeed have helped you hither long ago I had not been elsewhere busy, and certain that you yourself would find the way. Shun, then, the outer hells, and stick to the calm, lovely things of your youth. Seek out your marvelous city, and drive thence the recreant great ones, sending them back gently to those scenes which are of their own youth, and which wait uneasy for their return. Easier even than the way of dim memory is the way I prepare for you. See, there comes hither a monstrous shantak, led by a slave, who for your peace of mind had best keep invisible. Mount and be ready there. Yagosh the Black will help you on the scaly horror. Steer for that brightest star just south of the zenith. It is Vega, and in 2 hours will be just above the terrace of your sunset city. Steer for it only till you hear a far-off singing in the high aether. Higher than that lurks madness, so rein your shantak when the first note lures. Look then back to earth, and you will see shining the deathless altar flame of Ered-Na from the sacred roof of a temple. That temple is in your destroyed sunset city, so steer for it before you heed the singing and are lost. When you draw nigh, the city steer for the same high parapet whence of old you scanned the outspread glory, prodding the shantak till he cry aloud. That cry the great ones will hear and know as they sit on their perfumed terraces, and there will come upon them such a homesickness that all of your city's wonders will not console them for the absence of Kadath's grim castle, and the shint of eternal stars that crown it. Then must you land amongst them with the shantak, and let them see and touch that noisome hippolymphic bird, meanwhile discoursing to them of unknown Kadath, which you will so lately have left, and telling them how its boundless halls are lovely and unlighted, where of old they used to leap and revel in supernal radiance, and the shantak will talk to them in the manner of the shantaks, but it will have no powers of persuasion beyond recalling of elder days. Over and over must you speak to the wandering great ones of their home and youth, till at last they will weep and ask to be shown the returning path they have forgotten. The treat can you loosen the waiting shantak, sending him skyward with the homing cry of his kind, hearing which the great ones will prance and jump with antique mirth, and forthward stride after the loathly bird in the fashion of gods, through the deep gulfs of heaven to Kadath's familiar towers and domes. Then will the marvelous sunset city be yours to cherish and inhabit forever, and once more will earth's gods rule the dreams of men from their accustomed seat. Go now, the casement is open, and the stars await outside. Already your Shantak wheezes and titters with impatience. Steer for Vega through the night, but turn when the singing sounds. Forget not this warning, lest horrors unthinkable suck you into the gulf of shrieking and ululent madness. Remember the outer gods, they are great and mindless and terrible, and lurk in the outer void. They are good gods to shun. Heya, Ashanta Nega, you are off. Send back Earth's gods to their haunts on unknown Kadath, and pray to all space that you may never meet me in my 1,000 other forms. Farewell, Randolph Carter, and beware, for I am Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. And Randolph Carter, grasping and dizzy on his hideous Shantak, shot screamingly into space toward the coal-blue glare of Boreal Vega, looking but once behind him at the clustered and chaotic turrets of the Onyx Nightmare, wherein still glowed the lone lurid light of that window above the air, and the clouds of Earth's dreamland. Great polypus horrors slid darkly past, and unseen bat wings beat multitudinous around him, but still he clung to the unwholesome mane of that loathy and hippolymphic scaled bird. The stars danced mockingly, almost shifting now, and then to form pale signs of doom that one might wonder, had one not seen and feared before. And ever the winds of aether howled of vague blackness and loneliness beyond the cosmos. Faster flew the Shantak, and lower bent the rider, drunk with the marvels of strange gulps, and whirling in the crystal coils of outer magic. Then came too late the warning of the evil one, the sardonic caution of the demon legate who had bidden the seeker beware the madness of that song. Only to taunt had Nyarlathotep marked out the way to safety and the marvelous sunset city. Only to mock had that black messenger revealed the secret of those truant gods whose steps he could so easily lead back at will. For madness and the void, its wild vigilance, are Nyarlathotep's only gifts to the presumptuous. And frantic through the rider strove to turn his disgusting steed. That leering, tittering Shantak coursed on impetuous and relentless, flapping its great slippery wings in malignant joy, and headed for those unhallowed pits whither no dreams reach, that last amorphous blight of nethermost confusion, where bubbles and blasphemies at infinity's center, the mindless demon sultan Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud. Onward, onward, through the screaming, cackling, and blackly populous gulfs, and then from some dim blessed distance there came an image and a thought to Randolph Carter the doomed. Too well had Nyarlathotep planned his mocking and his tantalizing, for he had brought up that which no gusts of icy terror could quite efface. Home, New England, Beacon Hill, the waking world. For know you that your gold and marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth, the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows aflame with sunset, of the flower-fragrant common and the great domed on the hill, and the tangle of gables and chimneys, and the violet valley where the many-bridged Charles flow. Onward, onward! dizzyingly onward to ultimate doom through the blackness where sightless feelers pawed and slimy snouts jostled and nameless things tittered and tittered and tittered. But the image and the thought had come, and Randolph Carter knew clearly that he was dreaming, and only dreaming, and that somewhere in the background the waking world and the city of his infancy still lay. Words came again. You need only turn back to the thoughts and visions of your wistful boyhood. Turn, turn. Blackness on every side, but Randolph Carter could turn. Then, in the slow creeping course of eternity, the utmost cycle of the cosmos churned itself into another futile completion. And all things became again as they were, unreckoned kalpas before matter and light were born anew, as space once had known them, and comets, suns, and worlds sprang flaming into life, though nothing survived to tell that they had been and gone, always and always, back to no first beginning. Stars swelled to dawns, and dawns burst into fountains of gold, carmine, and purple, and still the dreamer fell. Cries rent the aether as ribbons of light beat back the fiends from outside, and hoary Nodens raised a howl of triumph when Nyarlathotep, close on his quarry, stopped baffled by a glare that seared his formless hunting horrors to gray dust. Randolph Carter had indeed descended at last that wide marmoreal flight to his marvelous city, for he was come again to the fair New England world that had wrought him. So to the organ chords of morning's myriad whistles, and dawn's blaze thrown dazzling through purple panes by the great gold dome of the State House on the hill, Randolph Carter leaped shoutingly awake within his Boston room. Birds sang in hidden gardens, and the perfume of tressallated vines came wistfully from arbors his grandfather had reared. Beauty and light glowed from classic mantel and carven cornice, and walls grotesquely figured, while a sleek black cat rose yawning from hearthside sleep that his master's start and shriek had disturbed. And vast infinities away, past the gate of slumber, and the enchanted wood, and the garden lands, and the Serenian sea, and the twilight reaches of Inganok, the crawling chaos Nyarlathotep strode brooding into the onyx castle atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and taunted insolently the mild gods of earth, whom he had snatched abruptly from their scented revels in the marvelous sunset city. So, that is the quest for unknown Kadath. As discussed earlier, this novella touches on other staple entities such as Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, the Cats of Ulthur, Pickman's model, Night Gaunts, and a plethora of others. Carter's story continues after this in The Silver Key of Dreams and finally Out of Eons, where we find an older, more mentally strained Carter after his experiences in the First World War and his constant contest of wills with the agents of the outer gods. I really love this novella because it gives you kind of a smorgasbord of the mythos in that way. The Chekhov's gun, so to speak, as a literary mechanic, is set up and paid off multiple times throughout the story. So that's really all I have for you guys today. If you like the story, feel free to throw me a subscribe, like, and comment. Tell me what was your favorite part. Did you like the cringe voice I did when Nyarlathotep did his whole monologue? Well, I'll see you next time, guys. That's it.